He is the answer to a question that gets asked at dinner tables and in classrooms and in the comment sections of the internet whenever people need a single name to stand for what human intelligence can achieve at its absolute limit. Who was the greatest mind who ever lived? Leonardo da Vinci. Every time, reliably, across cultures, across centuries, across arguments that disagree about almost everything else. His name lands the same way every time it is spoken in that context, with the particular weight of something that has been considered and accepted and is no longer seriously up for debate. And the case for him is real. Do not misunderstand that. The paintings alone would have made him one of the greatest artists in the history of Western civilization. The drawings alone would have made him one of the greatest draftsmen who ever lived. The Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, taken together, are arguably the two most recognized images in 500 years of Western art, reproduced so many billions of times that they have become almost impossible to see clearly anymore. The familiarity coating them, the way glass coats a painting, flattening the thing behind it. So yes, the case is real, but it is also, in a particular and important way, incomplete. Because here is what the poster does not tell you. Here is what the coffee mug and the classroom and the documentary you watched in school left out of the story of the greatest mind who ever lived. He finished fewer than 20 paintings in his entire life. He abandoned more commissions than he completed. He took money and disappeared. He left projects half done for years, for decades. He was considered by many of the people who hired him to be brilliant and unreliable and ultimately maddening to deal with. The city of Florence commissioned him to paint a great mural, and he worked on it for years and then simply stopped and never returned. A merchant named Francesco del Giocondo paid him to paint a portrait of his wife, and Leonardo kept the painting for 16 years and never delivered it. It was in his bedroom when he died. That is the Mona Lisa, the most famous painting in the history of the world, hanging in the Louvre behind bulletproof glass, visited by 10 million people a year who wait in line to stand 20 feet away from it for 90 seconds before being moved along. That painting was never delivered. The man who paid for it never received it. Leonardo took it with him to France, and it sat beside him for the last years of his life. And when they found him dead in his bed at Clos-Lucé in the summer of 1519, it was still there, leaning against the wall of the bedroom. Still technically unfinished, still technically not belonging to the world. Nobody knows exactly why he kept it. That is the kind of story this is. Because the paintings are not the story, the paintings are what he did to pay for everything else. He said so himself, more than once, in the notebooks he filled across 60 years of obsessive, relentless, secret inquiry. He considered himself an engineer, a scientist, a man trying to understand how the physical world was assembled and why it behaved as it did. The paintings were the income, the notebooks were the life, and the notebooks are where the story becomes something else entirely. 13,000 pages. 13,000 pages of mirror script, written backwards in his own left hand so that casual eyes could not read them without effort, filled with discoveries that would not be made again for another 200 years, 300 years, in some cases 500 years. He understood the mechanics of the human heart in ways that medical science would not confirm until 2014, when researchers using computer fluid dynamics finally proved what Leonardo had drawn from a dissected corpse in a Florentine hospital in the 1490s. He designed flying machines based on genuine aerodynamic principles derived from years of watching birds. He understood that the earth moved. He understood that the sun was a star. He wrote all of this down in the notebooks, in the mirror script, and he shared almost none of it with anyone, and he published none of it, not a single page. And when he died, the notebooks scattered across Europe like seeds carried by wind, and most of the knowledge in them simply vanished from the world. It had to be discovered again by other people who did not know they were not the first. This is the question the story of Leonardo da Vinci keeps circling back to. Not the question everyone asks, which is how one man could have been so many things. That question has a straightforward answer. He was built differently, at a level too fundamental to fully explain, and he worked with an obsessive relentlessness that the people around him found both extraordinary and exhausting. And he was alive at a moment in history when the entire framework of human knowledge was being reconstructed from the ground up, and a mind like his had more raw material to work with than any comparable mind had ever had access to before. That question is answerable. It is not the interesting question. The interesting question is why he kept it to himself. Why a man who understood more about the physical world than any human being alive chose to write it down in a script that most people could not read and share it with almost no one and publish none of it and carry it to his grave and beyond. Why the greatest scientific mind of the last 1,000 years conducted his inquiry in near total secrecy and left the results in notebooks that spent 2 centuries being lost, stolen, split apart, and scattered across the archives of 3 continents. The answer to that question is not in the paintings. It is in the life, in the specific shape of the life from the beginning, in what happened to him early and what it taught him about the safety of being known and the cost of being exposed, and the particular way a mind learns to protect itself by keeping what it contains inside rather than releasing it into a world that has already demonstrated its willingness to punish him for what he is. It starts in a village in Tuscany on a warm April night in 1452. During a lightning storm, he was not born famous. He was not born into the kind of life that the poster suggests he was destined for. He was born into a gap between 2 families, belonging fully to neither, and everything that followed, the paintings, the notebooks, the mirror writing, the abandoned commissions, the 16 years with the Mona Lisa in his bedroom, all of it follows from that gap with the quiet, inevitable logic of a life that was shaped at its foundation by the knowledge that the world was not entirely safe for what he actually was. Settle in. This is the complete story of Leonardo da Vinci, and it is nothing like what you have been told. The village of Anciano barely appears on most maps. It sits in the green hills of Tuscany, a few miles from the small town of Vinci, in a part of the world that the 15th century treated with the same indifference that every century treats the places it considers too small to remember. Stone farmhouses, olive groves running up the hillsides, the sound of water in the distance. The particular quality of Tuscan light in spring, golden and slightly heavy, the kind of light that arrives in April and makes everything look like it was arranged on purpose. The kind of place that has no reason to be remembered. It would be remembered. On the night of April 15th, 1452, a child was born in that village. The birth was recorded the following morning in the notebook of his paternal grandfather, Antonio da Vinci, in the careful handwriting of a man who understood that records mattered and took the task seriously. The entry is brief. It gives the time, the 3rd hour of the night, which by the reckoning of the era placed the birth sometime around 10 o'clock in the evening. It gives the name Leonardo. It gives the name of the father. It does not give the name of the mother. This omission is not accidental. In the Florence of 1452, the failure to record a mother's name in a birth document of this kind meant one thing precisely. The child was illegitimate. The mother was a woman to whom the father was not married and had no intention of becoming married to. A woman whose name the family would prefer not to attach permanently to the official record of the child's arrival. Her name was Caterina. This much is known. What else is known about her is considerably less certain and has been the subject of serious historical argument for decades. She may have been a local peasant girl. She may have been a slave or a servant of foreign origin. There is a document that some scholars believe refers to her as a Circassian slave in the household of a Florentine merchant. She was probably very young. She would go on, within a year or 2 of Leonardo's birth, to marry a local man, a lime burner, a craftsman of modest means, and have other children, and live a life that history has preserved almost exclusively through the accident of her connection to a son who would make her name worth knowing. She is the great absence at the center of the story. She gave Leonardo his first years and then, by the logic of her circumstances and the time she lived in, receded. And the man she receded from, Leonardo's father, Sir Piero da Vinci, moved in the opposite direction. Sir Piero was everything Caterina was not, in the terms that the Florence of 1452 measured everything. He was a notary, a profession that in Renaissance Italy carried genuine weight and social standing. Not quite a lawyer, but something close. The man who witnessed contracts and deeds and wills and the legal transactions that held the commercial world together. He was ambitious, he was connected, he had an office in Florence and a growing reputation and a clear sense of where he intended his life to go. And that destination did not include marrying a peasant girl, however it had included becoming involved with one. He acknowledged, Leonardo, this matters. He did not do what men in his position sometimes did, which was to acknowledge nothing and leave the child entirely to the mother's family. He brought the infant into his own father's household in Vinci, and when Caterina married her lime burner and started her new life elsewhere, Leonardo remained with the Da Vinci family. He was raised in his father's house with his father's name, with the identity of a Da Vinci intact. But he was not legitimate. And in the Florence of the 15th century, that distinction was not a matter of social embarrassment that faded with time. It was a legal condition with specific and permanent consequences. He could not join the major guilds. The guild system in Florence was the structure through which virtually all professional life was organized. The merchants, the lawyers, the doctors, the artists, all worked within guilds that required formal membership, and formal membership required a legitimate birth. He could not follow his father into the notarial profession. He could not practice law or medicine. Many of the roads that Ser Piero's ambition and intelligence might have opened for a legitimate son were simply closed, by law, before Leonardo could walk. He also could not inherit equally. He also could not claim the full social standing of the family name. He existed in a particular gap, acknowledged enough to carry the name, excluded enough to be always aware of what the name did not fully give him. Ser Piero married several times. His first wife was a woman named Albiera degli Amadori, who died without producing children. Then another wife, also childless. Then a third. Then a fourth. This meant that for a significant portion of Leonardo's childhood, he was the only child in the household, the illegitimate child, present by arrangement rather than by right, in a house that was waiting for legitimate heirs to arrive and had decided, in the meantime, to keep him. Think carefully about what that position feels like. Not abandoned, present. Not ignored, noticed, but present and noticed in a way that is always contingent, always carrying the implicit awareness that the arrangement exists because legitimate alternatives have not yet materialized, rather than because you are entirely wanted. The child in that position develops a particular kind of attention to the world around him, a sensitivity to subtle signals, a watchfulness, an acute awareness of where he stands in any room he enters, of what is said and what is carefully not said, of the gap between what people present and what they actually mean. Leonardo would carry this watchfulness for the rest of his life. It would show up in the paintings, in the way he rendered human faces, each one a study in concealed feeling, each expression caught at the precise moment before it reveals itself completely. It would show up in the notebooks, in the way he observed the world, with a patience and a precision that went beyond mere curiosity into something more like the attention of a person who has learned very early that understanding what is actually happening requires looking more carefully than most people bother to look. And it would show up in the mirror writing, in the decision made early and maintained throughout his entire working life to record what he found in a script that could not be casually read by anyone who happened to glance at the page. But that comes later. In the spring of 1452, he is newborn, and the hills of Tuscany are doing what the hills of Tuscany do in April, which is to be extravagantly beautiful in the way that places are beautiful when they have been allowed to remain themselves for a long time. He would paint those hills for the rest of his life, not literally, not the specific hills around Vinci and Anciano, with their particular stone formations and the specific way the light fell across them in the late afternoon, but the memory of them, the quality of them, the atmospheric distance, the blue-grey haze on the far mountains, the way the land receded into something soft and dreamlike at the edges of the frame. This is what appears behind the Mona Lisa and behind the Virgin of the Rocks and behind almost every major work he produced. You can look at the background of any Leonardo painting and see Tuscany. See the specific Tuscany of a child who spent his earliest years in those hills and encoded the landscape so deeply in his visual memory that it became, without his consciously choosing it, the permanent background of his imagination. There was no formal school in Anciano. There was no formal school in Vinci, not in the sense that the wealthy families of Florence would have understood the term. What there was, for the young Leonardo, was the countryside, the fields and the streams and the birds and the insects, and the particular quality of attention that a child with no structured curriculum and an unusual mind naturally directs toward the things immediately around him. He drew. This is the first thing that every account of his childhood agrees on, the thing that stood out to the people who knew him as a small child in Vinci. He drew obsessively, with a seriousness that did not look like play. He drew animals, plants, birds in flight, the patterns of flowing water, the shapes of things that interested him, and he drew them with a quality of observation that was, even then, something other than ordinary. His grandfather Antonio, who recorded the birth in his notebook, appears to have been a gentle and attentive presence. His uncle, Francesco, Ser Piero's younger brother, is described by later accounts as someone who spent time with the boy and encouraged his curiosity. These were not learned men in the formal sense. They were not scholars or philosophers, but they were present in the way that the adults in a child's life need to be present for curiosity to take root and grow. And Leonardo had, in those early Vinci years, a relatively uncrowded space in which to become himself. He had no Latin. This is important and tends to get underemphasized. Latin in the Florence of the 1450s and 60s was not merely a language. It was the gateway to the entire body of classical knowledge, to the philosophical and scientific and literary tradition that the Renaissance was in the process of excavating and celebrating. The educated men of Florence read Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and Pliny in the original. The debates happening in the great households and academies of the city were conducted with constant reference to classical texts. To lack Latin was to be locked out of that entire conversation. Leonardo lacked Latin and knew it and felt it. He taught himself Latin as an adult, imperfectly, working through it with the same fierce, self-directed energy he brought to everything else, but he never had it the way the formally educated men of his era had it, woven into his thinking from childhood, automatic and unquestioned. He called himself, in one of the notebooks, an homo senza lettere, a man without letters. It was not false modesty, it was an accurate description of a real gap, stated with the directness he brought to things he could not change. And here is the thing about that gap that history has not always understood clearly enough. It was also a gift. The educated men of Florence in the second half of the 15th century knew an enormous amount. They had the entire classical tradition at their disposal. They were immersed in a conversation about ideas that had been going on for 2,000 years, and they were magnificent participants in that conversation. And the Florence they built from that conversation was one of the most astonishing cultural achievements in human history. But they also could not easily see past it. The framework of inherited knowledge, the weight of classical authority, the assumption that the important questions had already been asked by Aristotle and the important answers were somewhere in the ancient texts. All of this pressed on the educated mind and shaped what it thought it was looking for. The educated man of the Florentine Renaissance looked at nature through the lens of what had already been said about nature. He looked at the body through the lens of Galen. He looked at the sky through the lens of Ptolemy. Leonardo looked at everything directly, not because he was somehow more pure or more open than the men who had received formal education, but because he had not been given the lens. He He had to construct his own account of how things worked from first principles, from direct observation, from the accumulation of what he could actually see and measure and test. And this meant that when the inherited account was wrong, when Galen was wrong about the body, when Ptolemy was wrong about the sky, Leonardo was positioned to see the wrongness in a way that the formally educated man was not. This is the paradox at the heart of his intellectual life. The illegitimacy that closed the doors of guild membership and professional respectability cracked open a different door, one that led somewhere the guild members could not easily follow. But the child in Vinci, in 1452, does not know any of this yet. He is drawing birds. He is watching the stream that runs through the valley below the village, the way the water moves over and around the stones, the patterns it makes, the way it behaves differently when the flow is fast and when it slows. He is looking at things with a quality of attention that will not leave him for the rest of his life. Ser Piero, meanwhile, is building his career in Florence. He is successful, increasingly prominent, moving in the circles of the powerful. He is not absent from his son's life entirely. There are records of visits, of involvement, but he is also not the primary figure of Leonardo's childhood. The primary figures are the grandfather, Antonio, and the uncle Francesco, and the hills, and the stream, and the birds, and the slow education of a child who has been left largely to his own attention. In the early 1460s, when Leonardo is somewhere around 10 years old, two things happen that change the direction of his life. The first is that Ser Piero's wife Albiera dies, still childless. There is no legitimate heir. The arrangement by which Leonardo lives in the Vinci household becomes, temporarily, less contingent. He is still the only child, still the boy who carries the name, still the one who fills the space that legitimate children have not arrived to fill. The second is that Ser Piero, and possibly others who had seen what Leonardo could do with a piece of chalk and a flat surface, begins to consider seriously what to do with his illegitimate son's obvious and unusual talent. The answer they arrived at would take Leonardo to Florence, to the workshop of one of the great artists of the age, to the city where everything that would define his life was waiting for him. But first, he spent a few more years in Vinci, walking the hills, drawing the birds, watching the water move. The hills would follow him to France. The water would follow him into the notebooks. The birds would follow him into the designs for machines that could carry a man into the sky. He was already becoming what he would be. It just had not yet found the city large enough to contain it. Florence in the 1460s was the most interesting city in Europe. This is not a sentimental assessment. It is a specific historical claim that the evidence supports with unusual clarity. The convergence of things happening in Florence in the decade into which the young Leonardo arrived from Vinci, the ideas, the money, the architecture, the art, the philosophy, the particular quality of ambition that a city generates when it is convinced itself that it is in the process of rebuilding a lost civilization from the ground up. This convergence was singular. There had been nothing quite like it before. There would not be quite like it again. The Medici were at the center of it. Cosimo de' Medici had established the family's dominance over the Florentine Republic in the previous decade, not by overthrowing the Republican institutions, but by working within them and around them with a patience and a political intelligence that his contemporaries recognized as extraordinary. His grandson, Lorenzo, who would become the most famous member of the family and acquire the name Il Magnifico, the Magnificent, was a teenager in the 1460s, already being prepared for the role he would inhabit with such complete assurance. The Medici were bankers, which meant they were connected to every major city in Europe and understood that ideas, like trade, moved across borders and that the patronage of the right ideas was itself a form of power. What the Medici patronized in those years was the recovery of antiquity. The manuscripts that scholars had been hunting across the monasteries of Europe and the libraries of Constantinople, the philosophical texts of Plato, the scientific works of Aristotle, the poetry of the classical world, these were being translated and debated and incorporated into a picture of human possibility that the educated Florentines of the 1460s found exhilarating. The argument, never quite stated, but always present, was that the civilization of ancient Greece and Rome had achieved something the medieval world had lost: a clarity about the nature of the human, about what the human mind was capable of, about the relationship between beauty and truth, and that Florence, uniquely among the cities of the 15th century, was positioned to recover it. The artists were the front line of this project. To be a painter or a sculptor in Florence in the 1460s was to be engaged in something that the culture around you considered genuinely important, not decorative, not merely skilled. Important in the way that philosophy was important, as a form of inquiry into the nature of things, an attempt to understand, through the making of images, what the human eye actually sees, what the human body actually does, what the natural world actually looks like when someone takes the trouble to look at it with sufficient care and sufficient ambition. The greatest workshop in Florence in the late 1460s was run by a man named Andrea del Verrocchio. Verrocchio was not simply a painter. He was a sculptor of the first rank, a goldsmith, a designer of military equipment, a musician, a man whose range of technical accomplishment across multiple disciplines made his workshop the most complete operation of its kind in the city. He produced paintings and sculptures and bronze castings and ceremonial objects and architectural designs, often simultaneously, with a staff of apprentices and assistants who learned by doing, by watching, by absorbing the methods of the workshop, the way you absorb a language when you are immersed in it young enough for the immersion to go deep. It was to this workshop that Ser Piero da Vinci brought his illegitimate son sometime around 1466, when Leonardo was approximately 14 years old. The exact circumstances of the arrangement are not documented in detail. What is documented is that it happened, and that it was the correct decision, and that what it set in motion would change the history of everything the workshop's discipline touched. Ser Piero had connections in Florence and an eye for what his son could do, and what his son could do with a piece of chalk on a flat surface. With the particular quality of visual attention he had been developing since childhood in the hills above Vinci, was already, at 14, something that required a larger context than a village notary's household could provide. Leonardo arrived in Florence and began to see what the world looked like when it was organized around the making of things. The workshop operated on a system that was part school, part business, part extended family. The apprentices lived and worked together, shared meals, observed the masters, executed portions of commissioned work under supervision, learned by doing and by watching, and by the particular absorption that happens when you spend your days surrounded by people who are extraordinarily good at something. The materials were everywhere. Pigments ground to specific consistencies, wood panels prepared with layers of gesso, bronze being worked in the foundry at the back, marble dust in the air from the sculptors. Leonardo moved through all of it. He was left-handed, which was noticed. Left-handedness in the 15th century was not the neutral, biological fact it is understood to be today. It was considered in various traditions and by various authorities to be at best inconvenient and at worst something requiring correction. The church had opinions. The schoolmasters had opinions. Most people with left-handed children in 15th century Florence tried to train them to use their right hands, with varying degrees of success and damage. Nobody appears to have tried to train Leonardo out of it. Perhaps they recognized even then that the hand was connected to something they did not want to disturb. He drew with his left hand, and he wrote with his left hand from right to left across the page. The letters formed in mirror image, so that the script could only be read comfortably in a reflection. This is the mirror writing that would fill every notebook he ever kept, thousands and thousands of pages of it. A lifetime of thought recorded in a form that required a mirror to be casually read. Why he wrote this way has been debated for centuries. The practical explanation, that a left-handed writer moving left to right would smear the ink with his hand as he went, and that moving right to left avoided this, is reasonable as far as it goes. The encoding explanation that the mirror script was a deliberate cipher, a way of protecting what he wrote from casual access, is also reasonable as far as it goes. The two explanations are not mutually exclusive. What is certain is that it became the form in which he thought. The notebooks are not documents written in code for strategic reasons. They are a man thinking in the script that came naturally to him, at a speed and in a form that matched the way his mind moved. Anyone who wanted to read them had to slow down, had to orient themselves differently, had to make a deliberate effort that casual curiosity would not sustain. He was, from the beginning, a man who put a distance between what he knew and what the world could easily access. But in the late 1460s and early 1470s, this is not yet the defining fact of his life. He is a young man in a great workshop, and the great workshop is doing what great workshops do, which is to produce, without pause, work of the highest standard for the most demanding clients in the most demanding city in Europe. He is learning, he is absorbing, he is becoming, in the company of Verrocchio and the other young men of the workshop, the artist he will be for the rest of his life. There is a story about a painting. Verrocchio was working on a large altarpiece, the Baptism of Christ, commissioned for a monastery outside Florence. The subject was conventional: John the Baptist pouring water over Christ, two angels attending. Verrocchio painted the central figures. He assigned the angels to his assistants. Leonardo painted one of the angels. The angel on the left of the finished painting, the one turned slightly inward toward the central scene, looking at the baptism with an expression of such composed and luminous attention that it seems to belong to a different category of reality than the figures around it. That angel is Leonardo's. You can see where his work ends, and Verrocchio's begins, not by looking for a seam exactly, but by noticing a shift in the quality of the air. Everything Leonardo touched in that painting is slightly more alive than everything around it. The angel's hair moves as if a real wind were in it. The landscape behind the angel has the blue atmospheric distance of hills seen through actual atmosphere rather than the schematic distance of hills painted from convention. The story, probably true in essence, probably embellished in its specifics, is that Verrocchio looked at what his young apprentice had done and put down his brush and announced that he would not paint again, that he recognized in this piece of work by this young man he had taken on at 14, something that exceeded him in a way he did not choose to compete with. Whether Verrocchio literally put down his brush and never painted again is uncertain. He continued to run the workshop, continued to produce sculpture and bronze work, but he appears not to have painted after this period. And the story is true in the way that stories are true, when they capture something that people who were present could recognize as essentially accurate, even if the specific details were sharpened in the telling. What is true, without any embellishment, is that Leonardo at 20 was already operating at a level that the most accomplished workshop in Florence found it impossible to surpass. He was also, during these years, moving through the social world of the city with the particular combination of visibility and privacy that would characterize his entire adult life. Florence was not a large city in the modern sense, perhaps 60 or 70,000 people, a world where the same faces appeared repeatedly in the same streets and the same guild halls and the same churches, where reputation traveled quickly and social identity was densely legible. He was known. He was the remarkable young man from Verrocchio's workshop. He was beautiful. Multiple accounts from people who knew him describe his physical appearance with the same consistent vocabulary: tall and well-made, elegant in his dress, with a quality of presence that made rooms notice his arrival. He was also, the historical record makes clear, not interested in the young women of Florence in the way that the young men around him were interested in them. He never married. He never had a documented romantic attachment to a woman at any point in his life. This was noticed in the way that everything in Florence was noticed, in the particular attentive social environment of a city where everyone's business was eventually everyone else's. In April of 1476, someone decided to do something about what they had noticed. the Florentine Republic maintained among its various institutional arrangements a box. It was called the tamburo, the drum. It stood near the entrance to a government building, and it was available to any citizen who wished to make an anonymous denunciation of another citizen for a crime. You wrote the accusation, placed it in the box, and the relevant authorities would investigate. The anonymity was the point. You did not need to sign your name. You did not need to face the person you were accusing. You simply needed to place the accusation in the box and let the system proceed. Someone placed a denunciation in the box concerning Leonardo da Vinci. The accusation was sodomy. The named partner was a young man named Jacopo Saltarelli, 17 years old, a goldsmith's apprentice, who was known, according to the denunciation, to make himself available to men who sought his company for these purposes. Leonardo was named as one of several men who had done so. The charge was serious. Florence had established, some decades earlier, a special magistracy called the Officers of the Night, the Ufficiali di Notte, specifically to investigate and prosecute sodomy. The night officers operated with broad authority. The penalties they could impose ranged from fines, through public shaming, to mutilation and death, though the most severe penalties were rarely applied in practice. What they could reliably do was destroy a reputation, end a career, make a life in Florence impossible. The case against Leonardo was opened, then it was dropped, then it was opened again. The official record gives no reason. The 2 openings and 2 closings of the case against Leonardo da Vinci in 1476 are documented in the archives of the night officers, without explanation, without any indication of why the process proceeded to the edge of consequence and then withdrew. He was not convicted, he was not publicly punished, he was not fined or shamed or mutilated. He was also not exonerated. The record was not expunged. The accusation existed and continued to exist in the archive of the city, a permanent document attesting to the fact that someone, in April of 1476, had decided that the remarkable young man from Verrocchio's workshop required the attention of the authorities. What protected him is not precisely known. The most common hypothesis involves the Medici. One of the other men named in the same denunciation was connected to the Medici household, and the Medici's capacity to make inconvenient processes go away was well established. This is plausible. It may even be correct, but it cannot be confirmed from what the archive contains. What can be confirmed is that Leonardo was 24 years old when this happened, that he had spent 10 years building a reputation and a position in the most competitive artistic environment in Europe, that he was at the beginning of what should have been a triumphant career in a city that had recognized what he could do and was prepared to commission it, and that in April of 1476, in a city where everyone knew everyone, and reputation traveled immediately, someone had placed a document in a government archive accusing him of a crime that carried, in the worst case, penalties of the most brutal kind. He was not imprisoned, he was not punished, he was not destroyed, but he was never the same. What changed is visible, in retrospect, in everything that follows: the careful management of distance between himself and other people, the refusal to let anyone get too close to what he was actually thinking, the notebooks written in a script that required deliberate effort to read, the abandoned commissions, the paintings left unfinished, the projects begun and then quietly withdrawn from, the pattern which would define his entire working life of engaging with the world on terms that he controlled, giving what he chose to give, withholding what he chose to withhold, maintaining always a space between the interior life and its exterior presentation that no one could easily cross without his consent. These are the habits of a man who has learned, at a formative moment, exactly what happens when the world is permitted uncontrolled access to what he is. He was not naive before 1476. The illegitimacy had already taught him something about contingency, about the conditions under which belonging was extended and could be withdrawn. But the accusation completed the education. It demonstrated, with the clarity of a near miss, that the world he was operating in was not a safe place for what he actually was, and that safety required a form of concealment, and that concealment, applied consistently enough, became its own kind of second nature. The mirror writing was already there. After 1476, the whole life became a kind of mirror writing. He stayed in Florence for several more years. He continued to work, to paint, to take on commissions. He was given a prestigious commission, the Adoration of the Magi, for the monastery of San Donato, and he began it with the energy and ambition the commission deserved, producing preparatory drawings of extraordinary quality, working out the composition with a completeness and a rigor that announced something exceptional was coming. He did not finish it. In 1482, he left Florence. He packed what he had, and he wrote a letter, and he turned his face toward Milan, toward a different court and a different patron, and the particular freedom of a city that did not know his history. He took with him his left hand and his notebooks and the habits of concealment that 1476 had finished teaching him. He also took the angel, not literally, but the quality of attention that had made the angel in Verrocchio's painting into something that exceeded everything around it, the capacity to look at a face or a landscape or a moving body and see it with a precision and a depth that went beyond what the conventions of the time demanded. This was his, permanently, assembled from 10 years in the best workshop in Florence and the particular solitude of a mind that had learned to keep its most important things inside. He was 30 years old. He had barely started. There is a document in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana in Milan that historians of the Renaissance return to again and again, not because it is the most beautiful thing Leonardo ever wrote, but because it is the most revealing. It is a letter drafted sometime around 1482 when Leonardo was approximately 30 years old, addressed to Ludovico Sforza, the ruler of Milan, known to the courts of Italy by the nickname Il Moro, the Moor, a reference to his dark complexion that he had, with a particular confidence of a powerful man chosen to embrace rather than resist. The letter was almost certainly a draft, a working version of something that was eventually sent or presented in fair copy. Whether it was drafted by Leonardo himself or by someone helping him navigate the conventions of diplomatic correspondence is debated. What is not debated is what it contains. It is, in 9 paragraphs, one of the most audacious letters of self-introduction in the history of the world. He begins not with painting, he begins with war. He tells Ludovico that he has considered the works of those commonly praised as inventors and designers of instruments of war, and that he finds those instruments in no way superior to what he can offer. He can design portable bridges, he writes, both light and strong, for use in pursuit of the enemy and in retreat. He can drain the water from moats during sieges. He knows how to destroy any fortress whose foundations are not built on stone. He can make cannon of beautiful and useful forms. He can make covered wagons, safe and indestructible, which will break through the ranks of the enemy and the artillery. He can design catapults and engines for hurling fire and other things. He can design ships capable of resisting even the heaviest artillery fire. 9 paragraphs of military engineering, offered by a man who had spent the previous 15 years painting angels and altarpieces, and an unfinished adoration of the Magi in the most artistically sophisticated city in Europe. Then, in the 10th paragraph, almost as an aside, he mentions that he can also work in painting and sculpture, and that he believes he would be able to produce in marble, bronze, or terracotta whatever might be compared with anyone else. That sentence is the entirety of his presentation of himself as an artist. One sentence, after 9 paragraphs of military engineering. The man who painted the angel that made Verrocchio put down his brush offers his artistic abilities as a footnote, a supplementary qualification, something the reader might find useful to know, but which is clearly not the point. This letter tells you almost everything important about how Leonardo understood himself. He did not consider himself primarily a painter. He considered himself a man who understood how physical systems worked, mechanical systems, hydraulic systems, optical systems, the systems of the human body, the systems of the natural world, and who could apply that understanding to whatever problem was placed in front of him, whether that problem was a flooded moat or an altarpiece commission, or the question of how light falls across a particular quality of skin at a particular time of day. Painting was one application. It happened to be the application that the world of 1482 was willing to pay for most reliably, but it was not, in his own understanding, what he was. What Ludovico Sforza made of this letter, the specific reading he gave it in his castle in Milan in 1482, is not documented. What is documented is that Leonardo arrived in Milan sometime around 1482 and entered the court of Il Moro, and that the association would last nearly 20 years and produce some of the most important work of his life. Milan was not Florence. This sounds obvious stated plainly, but the differences matter in ways that go beyond the geographic. Florence was a republic, technically, legally, in the forms and procedures by which it organized its public life. A republic. The Medici exercised their control through influence and patronage and the management of institutions rather than through direct authority, which meant that the city's culture was shaped by a certain kind of competitive energy, a jostling among the great families and the great artists and the great thinkers for position and recognition, in a system where no one held absolute power and everyone was always being watched and evaluated by everyone else. Milan was a court. Ludovico Sforza ruled with the directness of a man who had obtained power through force and maintained it through a combination of political intelligence and the willingness to use force again when necessary. His father, Francesco Sforza, had been a condottiere, a mercenary captain who had made himself Duke of Milan through military conquest. The family's legitimacy was recent and was sustained by capability and by the quality of the court they could assemble around them, by the brilliance of the artists and architects and engineers and scholars who made the Sforza court something that the other courts of Italy would find difficult to match. This was what Leonardo was entering, not a republic of competing equals, watched by a city of opinionated citizens, but a court organized around a single powerful center, where the key relationship was the one between the patron and the person he had chosen to favor. It suited him in certain ways. The court gave him distance from the specific social texture of Florence, from the specific history that 1476 had written into the city's memory. Milan did not know his story. In Milan, he could be exactly what his letter had presented him as, a universal man of extraordinary capability, offering his services to a ruler who understood the value of such things. The court provided resources that the workshop model of Florence had never provided: space, materials, assistance. The particular freedom that comes from having a powerful patron who wants you nearby and is willing to sustain the work without demanding immediate commercial return. It also gave him the time and the context for the project that would define everything. The notebooks began in earnest in Milan. Not that he had not been writing and drawing before. He had. The habit of recording what he saw and thought was deep and old, formed in the Vinci years and developed through the workshop years in Florence. But Milan gave him the stability and the space to do it. At the scale it required, the notebooks expanded, the scope of inquiry expanded. He was studying everything simultaneously: the movement of water, the mechanics of flight, the structure of the human body, the behavior of light. And he was recording all of it in the mirror script, in notebooks that nobody was looking over his shoulder to read. But the court also made demands, and the most significant demand of the Sforza court in the first years of Leonardo's time in Milan was for a monument. Francesco Sforza, Ludovico's father, the condottiere who had made the family, was dead. He deserved a monument appropriate to what he had been, which was a man of enormous physical and military force, a man whose legend was inseparable from the image of a powerful man on a powerful horse. Ludovico wanted an equestrian statue, bronze, larger than any equestrian statue that had been cast before, a statement in metal and scale about the Sforza dynasty and what it had made of Milan. He gave the commission to Leonardo. Leonardo began working on it with the obsessive completeness he brought to every problem that genuinely engaged him. He studied horses, not in the cursory way of an artist who needs a convincing horse in a painting, but with the systematic attention of a man who intends to understand horses fully, anatomically, mechanically, in motion and at rest, at every angle and in every condition. He drew hundreds of horses. He visited the stables of the great families of Milan and studied their animals the way he studied everything, looking for the principles underneath the appearances, the structural logic that governed how a horse moved and stood and carried weight and responded to force. He worked on the design for years. He produced a clay model. The model was enormous, more than 20 feet tall, the horse alone dwarfing any equestrian bronze that had previously been attempted. The technical problem of casting in bronze occupied him extensively. How to pour that volume of metal, how to support the mold, how to cool the cast without the imperfections that would ruin the surface of a work meant to be read from a distance and up close simultaneously. He solved the technical problems in his notebooks. The solutions are there, careful and complete, the record of a mind that approached casting bronze the way it approached everything else. From first principles, working out what the problem actually was before determining what the answer should be. The bronze was never poured. The bronze that had been set aside for the casting of the Sforza horse was requisitioned by Ludovico in 1494 and sent to his ally Ercole d'Este to be made into cannon. The French were coming. The political situation in Italy was deteriorating with the speed that political situations in Renaissance Italy were capable of deteriorating, which was very fast. The monument would have to wait. It waited, and while it waited, Leonardo worked on other things. The most important of these, in the years of the first Milan, was the painting on the wall of the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie, the Last Supper. The commission came from Ludovico, who was the patron of the church and who wanted its refectory, the room where the monks ate, decorated in a manner appropriate to the status of the site and the generosity of the donor. The subject was conventional, almost mandatory for a refectory. The last meal of Christ with his disciples, the moment of the announcement that one of the 12 men at the table had betrayed him. Leonardo made a technical choice that everyone who knew about painting recognized immediately as unconventional, and that the centuries since have confirmed as consequential in ways that were not fully understood at the time. A conventional refectory painting of this subject would have been executed in fresco, the ancient and well-established technique of painting onto wet plaster, which required working quickly while the plaster remained workable, committing to each section before it dried, producing a surface that once set was extraordinarily durable and long-lasting. Fresco was the technique of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, which Michelangelo was painting at roughly the same time in Rome. Fresco was how such things were done. Leonardo did not paint in fresco. He developed, or adapted, or invented. The precise origin of his technique is still debated by conservators. A mixed method that applied layers of tempera and oil paint over a specially prepared surface of pitch, gesso, and mastic. The purpose was to allow him to work slowly, to paint and then stop and look and think and return and revise, to apply the particular quality of sustained attention that his mind required to a surface that would not set hard beneath him while he was still deciding what the surface should become. Fresco forced urgency. Leonardo's method allowed the kind of extended deliberation that was, for him, inseparable from the act of making. The painting deteriorated within his own lifetime. The technique was incompatible with the damp walls of Milan in a way that fresco would not have been incompatible. By the time Leonardo left Milan, the painting was already beginning to lose the surface he had spent years building. By the time of his death, serious damage was visible. By the 16th century, visitors were describing it as ruined. By the late 18th century, Napoleon's soldiers used the wall for target practice. By the late 19th century, what remained was a ghost of what had been made. And yet the Last Supper is still, in the damaged and restored and redamaged state in which it exists today in the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie, one of the most powerful images in the history of Western painting. Not because of its surface, the surface is largely gone, but because of what the surface once recorded and what survives in the copies and engravings that were made before the deterioration became irreversible, and what the structure of the composition communicates even through the damage. What Leonardo painted was not, in the conventional sense, a religious image. It was a study in the human response to catastrophic news. He painted the moment immediately after Christ announces that one of the 12 men at the table has betrayed him. Not the moment before, not the moment of the announcement itself, the moment immediately after, when the words have landed and each of the 12 men is responding to them in the specific, individual, psychologically precise way that his particular character and his particular relationship to the announcement requires. Peter, fierce and impulsive, leans forward in anger. John, the youngest, closest to Christ, sits back in something that is almost shock, his whole body going quiet in the way that bodies go quiet when they have received something they cannot immediately process. Judas, and this was the detail that Leonardo reportedly spent the most time on, walking the streets of Milan in search of the right face, sits slightly forward, his hand moving unconsciously toward the bread, his expression a specific compound of guilt and defiance, and the desperate self-preservation of a man who has already made his choice and cannot unmake it. Christ is still at the center of all this turbulence, at the convergence point of all the radiating emotion and movement and response. He is utterly still. His hands rest open on the table, his eyes are cast down. He has said what needed to be said, and now he is waiting, and the waiting is a kind of sorrow so complete that it does not require expression. Leonardo spent years on the faces. This is documented. He wandered Milan, looking for faces that contained what he needed. He made preliminary drawings. He revised. He returned to faces he had already painted and revised them again. He was looking for the specific truth of each specific response, not the general truth of distress or surprise or guilt, but the particular truth of how this precise person, with this precise history, would respond to this precise announcement at this precise moment. This was not what altarpiece painters did. Altarpiece painters rendered recognizable types with recognizable gestures in recognizable meanings. The language was conventional, and the conventions served a purpose. They were legible, they communicated reliably to audiences who shared the visual vocabulary. They did not demand from the viewer the sustained attention that something genuinely unfamiliar requires. Leonardo was not interested in the conventions. He was interested in the truth, in the specific and particular truth of how human beings actually look and move and respond, in the investigation of the face as the surface on which interior states become briefly legible. This investigation had been going on since Florence, since the workshop, since the angel whose hair moved in a real wind. But the Last Supper is where it achieves its fullest early expression, where the inquiry that had been running in the notebooks and the preliminary drawings and the unfinished paintings finally found a single wall large enough to contain it. He was still in Milan, still working within the orbit of the Sforza court when the French arrived. In September of 1499, the army of Louis XII crossed into Lombardy. Ludovico Sforza, who had invited the French into Italy 15 years earlier as a political maneuver, and had spent the intervening years discovering the consequences of that invitation, fled Milan before they reached the city. The court dissolved. The patronage that had sustained Leonardo for nearly 20 years evaporated with the speed that patronage evaporates when the patron is gone. The clay model of the Sforza horse still stood in its courtyard. French soldiers arriving in the city used it for target practice. Crossbow bolts knocked chunks from the clay. Rain finished what the soldiers had begun. Within a few years, the enormous monument that Leonardo had spent a decade designing and building, the largest equestrian sculpture ever attempted, was gone. The notebooks contained his solutions for casting it in bronze. The bronze had been made into cannon. The clay was dust. He left Milan in December of 1499. He was 47 years old. He had spent the most productive years of his life in this city, had produced work here that would define what painting was understood to be capable of, had filled hundreds of notebook pages with inquiries into the nature of things that he had shared with almost no one. He had also, once again, left something unfinished. The Sforza horse was not a painting. It was not a commission he could take with him in his notebooks and return to in some future city. It was a thing that had existed in the physical world, enormous and specific, and it was now gone. The patron who had sustained the dream was gone. The bronze had been cast into cannon. The clay had been destroyed by men who did not know what they were destroying. He picked up what he could carry and turned toward the road south, toward Florence, toward a changed city and a changed world, and a new commission that would result, eventually, in the most famous painting in human history. But first, there was a letter to write. To a new patron in a new city, offering once again the services of a man who could build bridges and drain moats and design artillery, and also paint, if that would be useful. Begin with the physical fact of them, not with what they are. Objects in the world, made of paper and ink, produced by a left hand moving right to left across the page, filling every available surface with a density of recorded thought that has no real equivalent in the history of human inquiry. Some are bound, some are loose leaves gathered by later hands, trying to impose order on what they found. Some are small enough to fit in a coat pocket. Leonardo carried these when he went out, so that anything he noticed in the street, or the market, or the anatomy theatre could be committed to paper before the observation faded. Some are large workshop sheets, covered from edge to edge with drawings and calculations, and the marginal notes that accumulate when a mind is working on several things simultaneously, and needs to put each thread somewhere it can be found again. 13,000 pages survive. 13. Take a moment with that number. It represents what survived, the notebooks that were not lost, not destroyed, not stolen, and dispersed, and eventually dissolved into the archives of institutions that did not know what they had. The scholars who have studied the question believe that what survives may be approximately half of what Leonardo actually produced, which means the complete record, if it could be assembled, would run to something approaching 25,000 pages of mirror script. One man, 60 years of working life, the private record of a mind that did not distinguish between what was worth writing down and what was not, because everything was worth writing down. Everything he saw, everything he thought, every problem that presented itself to his attention, and the solution he worked toward, every observation from the anatomy theatre and the stable and the kitchen and the river, every mechanical design and every philosophical question, and every small sharp notation about the behaviour of light on water at a particular hour of the afternoon, in a particular season. Everything. The question of what is in them is genuinely difficult to answer, not because the notebooks are obscure, but because the scope of what they contain resists the compression that answering the question seems to require. To say that the notebooks contain work in anatomy, geology, botany, hydraulics, optics, astronomy, architecture, music, and the mechanics of flight is accurate. It is also something like saying that the ocean contains water. The statement is true and tells you almost nothing about what it is actually like to stand in front of it. So let us go slowly. Let us begin with the heart. Sometime in the first years of the 16th century, working in a hospital in Florence, with access to the bodies of the deceased, Leonardo dissected a human heart. Not for the first time. He had been performing dissections since at least the late 1480s, working through hospitals and anatomy theatres, and whatever arrangements he could make with the institutions that had custody of the dead. He had drawn the skull, the spine, the muscles of the arm and shoulder, the structure of the fetus in the womb, the mechanics of the eye, the architecture of the brain. He had done things with the bodies of the dead that the medicine of his era had not done with comparable rigor. And he had recorded what he found with a precision and a three-dimensional completeness that would not be matched by medical illustration for generations. But the heart was different. The heart was the organ that the medicine of his era understood least well and explained most confidently. The dominant theory of cardiac function, inherited from the ancient physician Galen and transmitted through the centuries of medieval medicine with the unquestioned authority of canonical text, held that blood was produced in the liver, flowed through the body being consumed by the organs that needed it, and was refreshed by an ebb and flow motion through pores in the wall between the heart's two chambers. The heart, in this account, was a kind of furnace. It heated the blood and gave it vital spirit, and the blood moved through the body in the way that tides move, back and forth, consumed and replenished. This account was wrong, not in minor details. Wrong at the level of basic mechanism. There are no pores in the septum between the heart's chambers. Blood does not move through the body by ebb and flow. The heart is not a furnace. Galen had described what he expected to find on the basis of his theoretical commitments, and his descriptions had been accepted and transmitted and taught for 14 centuries because nobody had looked carefully enough at an actual heart to notice that what Galen described was not what was there. Leonardo looked. He made a cast of the aortic valve, the valve at the outlet of the heart's main pumping chamber, through which blood passes on its way into the aorta and from there to the body. He filled the cast with glass and studied the shape of the valve's three cusps and the way they moved. He was trying to understand something that had not previously been investigated with any rigor: how the valve actually opened and closed, what forces governed its movement, what happened in the fraction of a second between the heart's contraction and the valve's response. What he found was that the blood flowing through the aortic valve did not move in a simple straight stream. It moved in a spiraling helical pattern, like water moving through a twisted channel. As the blood passed through the valve's curved cusps, it formed vortices, rotational eddies, in the flow, and these vortices filled the pockets of the valve cusps and pushed them gently closed after each heartbeat, preventing the blood from flowing backward into the heart. He drew this. He drew it with a completeness and an accuracy that, when the drawings were examined by cardiac researchers in the 20th century, proved to be essentially correct. The helical flow of blood through the aortic valve was confirmed by researchers at the University of Oxford in 1969, using modern fluid dynamics techniques. The specific mechanism by which the vortices close the valve, the mechanism Leonardo had described in mirror-script in a notebook sometime around 1513, was confirmed by a study published in the Journal of the Royal Society Interface in 2014. 500 years. The gap between Leonardo drawing the helical flow of blood in a notebook and the scientific establishment confirming that the drawing was accurate is 500 years. In those 500 years, people died of aortic valve disease of precisely the structure Leonardo had described, without medical science understanding the mechanism well enough to address it effectively. The knowledge existed, it was in the notebooks. The notebooks were in a library in Windsor Castle, catalogued and preserved and available to scholars, and the specific drawings of the aortic valve were examined and admired as extraordinary specimens of anatomical draftsmanship. And the science in them, the actual content, the discovery embedded in the drawings, was not recognized for what it was until 5 centuries after the man who made them had put down his brush. This is not an isolated instance. It is the pattern. He understood, working from his observations of the fetal membranes and the structure of the placenta, aspects of embryological development that formal medicine would not articulate for generations. He described the mechanics of the spine with an accuracy that astonished the anatomists, who finally studied his drawings seriously. He drew the muscles of the shoulder and the hip and the face with a completeness that required medical illustration to catch up step by careful step across the following centuries. He also worked in directions that had nothing to do with medicine. He watched water for decades, not casually, systematically, with the obsessive attention that he brought to everything that genuinely engaged him, sitting beside rivers and streams and irrigation channels of Milan and Tuscany, and observing how water moved, how it behaved at different speeds and around different obstacles, what patterns it made, what principles governed the patterns. The notebooks on hydraulics run to hundreds of pages. He described turbulence, he described the behavior of waves, he described the way water moves around obstructions and the way those movements carry sediment and shape landscapes over time. He was approaching, from pure observation, the phenomena that the mathematical theory of fluid dynamics would not be formalized until the 19th century by figures like Navier and Stokes, whose names now attach to the equations that describe what Leonardo was drawing in his notebooks 300 years before they were born. He watched birds. This is perhaps the best known of his investigative obsessions, partly because the flying machines have a visual drama that makes them irresistible to anyone looking for the Leonardo of legend, the impossible dream, the genius who wanted to fly centuries before flight was possible. But the flying machines are the output of something more fundamental. Before the machines, there was the watching. He studied birds in flight with the systematic patience of a man who understood that before you can design something that works, you must understand what you are trying to replicate. He made drawings of birds at every stage of flight, rising, banking, diving, landing, that captured the mechanics of wing movement with an accuracy that required high-speed photography to confirm. He understood that birds did not simply flap their wings up and down, but used the asymmetric surface of the wing to generate lift, twisting the feathers at the wingtip to adjust the angle of attack. He described the way different wing shapes were adapted for different flight conditions. The long, narrow wings of birds that soar on thermals, the short, broad wings of birds that need quick maneuvering through obstacles. From this, he designed the ornithopter. The machine with flapping wings was the most famous of his flying designs. But there were others. A device with a helical screw that would, when spun fast enough, push against the air and rise vertically. A hang glider with a rigid wing structure and a pilot suspended beneath it. A parachute for descending safely from height. None of these machines flew in Leonardo's lifetime. Some of them, when reconstructed from his drawings, have been shown to be based on sound aerodynamic principles. The hang glider design, reconstructed in 2002, flew. The parachute, reconstructed in 2000 and dropped from a hot air balloon at 10,000 feet, worked. He understood that the sun did not move around the Earth. He wrote in the notebooks that the Earth was not the center of the universe, that it was a small body in a vast space, that the sun was a star, that what appeared to be the movement of the sun across the sky was in fact the movement of the Earth. He wrote this decades before Copernicus published his heliocentric model, in a notebook that no one read who would have understood its implications. He described in the geological sections of the notebooks the process by which marine fossils came to be found in the mountains of Italy, not through the biblical flood, which was the standard explanation, but through the slow movement of the Earth's crust over vast spans of time, the seafloors rising to become mountain ranges across periods so long that human history was a negligible fraction of them. He was describing, in the late 15th century, what the 19th century would call geology and the 20th century would call plate tectonics. Now hold all of this in your mind at once. The heart, the blood, the embryo, the water, the birds, the sun, the mountains. Across all of it, the same method, direct observation, careful drawing, patient investigation of the principle underneath the appearance, the willingness to set aside what everyone believed in favor of what was actually there to be seen. And none of it published. Not a page, not a paragraph, not a single observation extracted from the mirror script and offered to the world of natural philosophy in the form that would allow it to be received and tested and built upon. He intended to publish. This is documented in the notebooks themselves, in the introductions he wrote to sections he was organizing, in the promises he made to himself about what he would assemble and release. He wrote introductions to treatises on painting, on anatomy, on hydraulics, on the mechanics of flight. He organized sections, he numbered pages, he did the work of preparing material for transmission to readers who did not yet exist. And then he did not finish. And then he moved cities, and then a patron's court dissolved, and he packed what he could carry, and the organized sections became disorganized, and the numbered pages became shuffled, and the treatises that were going to explain what he had found remained in the form of working notes rather than finished arguments, because a finished argument requires the sustained attention of a man who has stopped gathering new material, and Leonardo never stopped gathering new material, because the world kept presenting new problems, and new problems were always more interesting than than the completion of explanations for old ones. There is another possibility. It sits alongside the perfectionism and the perpetual distraction, and does not quite cancel them, but complicates them. The possibility that a man who had learned, at 24, what it cost to be seen clearly, had decided that the safer disposition toward knowledge was to hold it rather than release it, that the mirror writing was not merely a left-hander's convenience, but a structural expression of a relationship to the world in which what you knew was under your control, for as long as you kept it inside, and ceased to be under your control the moment you put it in a form that other people could read without effort. This cannot be proven. It is a reading of a pattern of behavior, not a fact extracted from a document. Leonardo never wrote, in the notebooks or anywhere else that has survived, an explanation of why he did not publish what he knew. He promised repeatedly that he would. He never explained why he did not. What can be said with certainty is this: the notebooks were the truest expression of what he actually was. Not the paintings, though the paintings are magnificent, not the engineering projects, though several of them anticipated technologies by centuries. The notebooks, the private accumulation of a lifetime of looking, in the script that most people could not easily read, organized only by the logic of a mind that moved between subjects the way water moves between channels, following the gradient of its own interest. They were also, in the most precise sense, a conversation with no one. He wrote in them the way some people speak to themselves, not for an audience, not for transmission, not for the purpose of being understood by another person, but for the purpose of thinking. The act of setting the observation down in the mirror script was itself part of the investigation, the way that writing a thing makes you understand it differently than simply thinking it. He was in the notebooks, his own reader and his own interlocutor, conducting in private an inquiry of a scope that no institution or patron or collaborator of his era would have been equipped to sustain. This is what was lost. Not the specific discoveries, though the specific discoveries matter, and the gap they left in the history of science and medicine is real and measurable. What was lost was the conversation. The possibility that the questions Leonardo was asking in 1510 in a hospital in Florence could have been received by the natural philosophers of 1510 in a form that allowed them to ask the next questions, that the understanding of the heart he had achieved through direct observation could have entered medicine when it was achieved rather than 500 years after the man who achieved it had been buried in a church in France. Knowledge accumulates when it is shared. It stalls when it is held in private, however brilliantly. He held it privately in 13,000 pages of mirror script that waited, patient and unread, while the world he had outpaced caught up. He went to Venice first, December of 1499, leaving Milan with the French army at the gates, and Ludovico Sforza somewhere on the road toward the Alps. He stopped in Mantua long enough to draw a portrait of Isabella d'Este, the Marchioness, who wanted Leonardo to paint her, and pursued the commission with a persistence that the historical record finds almost touching. Letter after letter to Leonardo and to people who knew Leonardo, requesting, reminding, eventually simply asking whether he intended to honor the sitting at all. He never delivered the painting. The preparatory drawing exists. It is, even as a drawing, extraordinary. The face of an intelligent and watchful woman, rendered with a specificity that makes the conventions of formal portraiture look like conventions. He left it with her and moved on. Venice. He was there briefly in the winter of 1500, and he worked while he was there with the characteristic urgency of a man who is between stable situations and needs to demonstrate his value to anyone who might provide the next one. The Ottoman Turks were a pressing military concern for Venice, a maritime power in close proximity to an expanding empire. Leonardo, who had offered Ludovico Sforza 9 paragraphs of military engineering before mentioning that he could also paint, offered Venice something similar, a proposal for a submarine, a device that could approach enemy ships underwater and sink them. He described it in the notebooks and then declined to provide the full design. He wrote that he had decided against disclosing the complete method because of the evil nature of men who would use it for assassination at the bottom of the seas. This sentence sits in the notebooks with a quality of self-awareness that the rest of the Leonardo story tends not to fully engage with. He understood that the things he designed could kill people. He was not naive about the application of military engineering. He had spent 20 years in the court of a man who was, whatever else he was, a ruler of a city-state in a peninsula where city-states survived or did not survive based largely on their capacity for organized violence. He had designed weapons. He had designed them carefully and well, in the full understanding of what they were for. And here, in Venice, in the winter of 1500, he declined to complete a design because men would use it to kill. The line does not resolve the contradiction. It simply marks the place where Leonardo was aware the contradiction existed. He went back to Florence in the spring of 1500. He was 47 years old. He had been gone for 18 years. The city had changed. The Medici had been expelled. A Dominican friar named Savonarola had briefly seized moral authority over the Republic before being hanged and burned in the same Piazza della Signoria where he had previously burned books and mirrors and musical instruments, and the Republic had been reconstituted in a form that was attempting, with varying success, to govern itself without the Medici's guiding hand. The streets were the same. The workshops were still there, still producing. His old master Verrocchio had been dead for a decade. Leonardo settled in the city of his apprenticeship and began working with a deliberateness that suggested a man who understood he was at a turning point and was taking his time, deciding which way to turn. He lived in the monastery of Santissima Annunziata, where the friars gave him a workshop in exchange for a promised altarpiece. He worked on preparatory cartoons for the altarpiece, preparatory drawings of a scale and quality so astonishing that, according to the contemporary historian Giorgio Vasari, people came from all over Florence to see them displayed in the monastery, standing in front of them in silence, in the way you stand in front of things that have no adequate response. The altarpiece was never painted. He was also, during this period in Florence, watching. He watched the political situation in Italy with the attention of a man who understood that the political situation in Italy determined who the patrons were and what they needed, and whether a man of his particular combination of skills had a place in the world those patrons were trying to build. What he was watching, in 1501 and into 1502, was the rise of Cesare Borgia. To understand what it meant that Leonardo eventually accepted Cesare Borgia's commission, you have to understand what Cesare Borgia was, not in the simplified form that the word Borgia has come to carry, a shorthand for Renaissance villainy, for poison and intrigue, and a particular ruthlessness that the family's enemies attributed to them, and the family's friends declined to deny in the specific, documented, historical form. Cesare Borgia was the illegitimate son of Rodrigo Borgia, who had become Pope Alexander VI in 1492. He had been made a cardinal at 17 by his father's authority, had resigned the cardinalate, an almost unprecedented act, and had embarked on a systematic military campaign to conquer the territories of central Italy known as the Romagna and the Marche. By 1502 he had largely succeeded. He controlled a substantial territory in central Italy. He was operating with the military backing of the French crown and the political backing of his father, the Pope, and he was moving through the region with a combination of force and diplomacy and the targeted elimination of opposition that Niccolo Machiavelli would observe at close range and later theorize in The Prince as the model of effective political action. He killed people, not in the diffuse, institutional way that armies kill people, though he did that too, in the direct way. People who had been useful to him and then became inconvenient were found dead. People who opposed him were captured and executed. The cruelty was deliberate and visible, and was understood by everyone in his vicinity to be deliberate and visible, because visible cruelty was a tool of political management as surely as diplomacy was. It shaped what the people around you believed you were capable of, and what they believed you were capable of shaped what they thought was possible when they considered opposing you. This was the man who offered Leonardo a commission in the summer of 1502. The terms were substantial. Leonardo was appointed official engineer and architect for Cesare Borgia's domains, charged with inspecting and assessing the fortifications and military installations of the territory. He was given a letter of passage, a document in Borgia's hand ordering every official in every town in the Romagna to admit Leonardo freely and assist him in whatever he required. He was given resources, salary, authority. He was given, in the terms that mattered most to him, a problem to solve: how to improve the defenses and infrastructure of a significant territory using engineering principles and careful observation of the landscape. He went to work. He traveled through the Romagna with a small group of assistants, assessing fortifications, measuring harbors, drawing maps. The maps he produced in this period are among the most accurate maps made in Europe up to that point, the result of a systematic approach to cartography that treated the representation of landscape as an engineering problem requiring the same rigor as any other engineering problem. Not the conventional decoration of a document, but a precise scaled representation of the relationship between places as they actually existed in physical space. The most famous of these is the map of Imola, a bird's eye view of the town and its fortifications drawn to a consistent scale, oriented by compass points, so precise in its representation of the streets and buildings and walls of Imola that it could still be used today to navigate the city's historic center. It is one of the first accurately scaled maps of a town ever made. It is also, in the most literal sense, a document produced in the service of a military campaign. Cesare Borgia needed to know the fortifications of the towns he was controlling. Leonardo gave him a document that showed every wall, every gate, every vulnerable point with perfect clarity. The notebooks from this period are filled with the practical work of military engineering: canal proposals, fortification assessments, port improvements, measurements and calculations, and the specific technical observations that a skilled engineer makes when walking the ground of a territory he has been hired to understand. There is nothing in them that resembles distress, no note of doubt about the man he was working for, no reflection on the gap between the birds he freed from market cages and the weapons he was designing to be used against the people who lived in the towns he was mapping, no record of a night in some Romagnan inn when he considered what Cesare Borgia's campaign was actually doing to the landscape he was so carefully documenting. This needs to be stated plainly, without the softening that Leonardo's admirers have sometimes applied to this period. He was working for a man who was conquering territory through systematic violence, and he was making that conquest more efficient. The maps he drew were intelligence documents. The fortification assessments he produced were strategic analyses. The engineering improvements he proposed would make Borgia's military apparatus more capable of doing what Borgia's military apparatus was doing, which was killing people and taking their towns. Leonardo was 50 years old. He had spent his adult life moving from patron to patron, from commission to commission, in a world where the patrons were powerful and the commissions were what the powerful required. He needed money. He needed the stability that came from having a powerful employer. The work was technically interesting. The cartography alone, the problem of representing three-dimensional landscape accurately at consistent scale, was the kind of problem his mind moved toward the way water moves toward a drain, with the inevitability of matching geometry. He was genuinely good at it. He produced work in this period that was, in its own terms, extraordinary. He was also helping Cesare Borgia conquer the Romagna. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The transcript of Leonardo's life does not permit the simplification that resolves them into one thing or the other. He was a man of genuinely unusual sensitivity. The vegetarianism, the freed birds, the notebooks full of observations so attentive that it crosses from science into something closer to love, the specific quality of attention he brought to the face of every person he drew, the refusal to render any human being as a type, rather than as a particular individual whose particularity was worth the effort of understanding. He was also a man who designed military technology for whoever was paying, including men whose campaigns required the kind of technology he was providing. The line about the submarine sits in the notebooks, not as an explanation of why he would not do certain things, but as a marker of where his awareness of the problem was located. He was aware that his inventions could be used for assassination at the bottom of the seas. He was aware of the evil nature of men. He had worked for the evil nature of men carefully and well for most of his professional life. Machiavelli was in the Romagna at the same time. Leonardo was, also in Borgia's orbit, also observing the machinery of effective political violence at close range, also taking careful notes in a form that would not be published in his lifetime. The two men almost certainly encountered each other. They were in the same territory, serving the same employer in the same months of 1502. What they said to each other, if they spoke, is not recorded. What each of them was observing from their respective angles was how power actually worked when it was stripped of the courtesies that the public presentation of power required. How the efficient application of force, how the calculations of the powerful proceeded in the specific, unsentimental terms that the powerful used when they were not performing for an audience. Leonardo recorded the landscape. Machiavelli recorded the principles. Neither of them wrote, in the documents that survive, a word of moral judgment about the man they were both serving. The Borgia employment ended abruptly in the spring of 1503. Cesare's military campaign had stalled, partly through bad luck, and partly through the illness that was beginning to compromise his extraordinary physical energy. His father, the Pope, died in August of 1503, and with the death of Alexander VI, went the political foundation on which Cesare's entire enterprise rested. Within a year, he would be a fugitive. Within 4 years, he would be dead. Killed in a minor skirmish in Navarre at 31, his empire dissolved, his territory redistributed, his name entering the language as a synonym for brilliant ruthlessness applied in the service of ultimately futile ambition. Leonardo went back to Florence. He went back to the city of his apprenticeship and his accusation and his unfinished adoration, carrying new notebooks filled with maps and fortification assessments and the specific technical knowledge that a year of walking the Romagna had produced. He also carried, apparently without particular difficulty, the experience of having been an instrument of Cesare Borgia's campaign. He did not write about it in terms of regret. He did not write about it in terms of satisfaction. He filed the knowledge he had gained, the cartographic techniques, the engineering insights, the specific understanding of how terrain and fortification related to each other, in the notebooks alongside everything else he had learned. And he moved forward because moving forward was what he did. There was a new commission waiting in Florence, a large one, a wall in the city's great council hall, to be painted with a scene from Florentine military history. Across the same hall, another commission had been given to a young sculptor who had recently completed a marble David that the city was still adjusting to the shock of. His name was Michelangelo. He was 28. Leonardo was 50. The collision that was coming between these two men in that hall, over those two walls, would define the subsequent 400 years of argument about what painting was and what it was for. But first, Leonardo had a canvas to prepare and a technique to choose. He chose badly, or rather, he chose the way he always chose, experimentally, ambitiously, in the service of doing something that had not been done before, without sufficient regard for whether what had not been done before had not been done before, for good reason. The painting he was about to attempt would never be finished. The wall would begin to deteriorate almost as soon as he had started. He would walk away from it, eventually, as he had walked away from everything, and the great battle scene that was supposed to crown his return to Florence would survive only in copies and descriptions. Another ghost in the long procession of things Leonardo began and did not complete. But that was still ahead, for now he sharpened his chalk and looked at the wall. There is a drawing in the Royal Collection at Windsor Castle. It shows a human uterus, cut open, with a fetus curled inside it in the last weeks before birth. The fetus is drawn at roughly actual size, about 14 inches from crown to heel, and the drawing shows the fetal position with a precision and a completeness that required the examination of an actual pregnant uterus, opened and studied because the information in the drawing could not have been assembled from description or from the diagrams in any book then available. What holds you when you look at it is not the precision, it is the fetus's face. He drew the face, not in the schematic, symbolic way that medical illustration of the era rendered the fetus as a miniature adult, as a diagram of stages, as a demonstration of principle. He drew the face as a face with a specific closed-eyed, soft-featured, not quite finished quality of a face that has not yet encountered the world and is still in the process of becoming what it will be. He drew it with the same attention he brought to the face of every person he ever rendered, as a particular thing, this specific thing, not a type. He was the only person in the history of Western art who could have drawn that face. And nobody saw it for 300 years. Leonardo da Vinci began dissecting human bodies sometime in the late 1480s, during the first Milan period, when access to the anatomy theatre of the Hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, and later the Ospedale Maggiore in Milan, gave him what his inquiries into the human form had always required, and what the conventions of artistic training had always withheld: the actual interior of the body, opened and available for examination. The medical establishment of the 15th century performed dissections. This is important to understand. Leonardo was not doing something that had never been done. Human dissection had been formally authorized by the Church since the 13th century, conducted at universities as part of the training of physicians, supervised by professors who read aloud from Galen while a barber surgeon made the cuts. The purpose was to confirm what the text said. The dissection was a demonstration, not an investigation. You opened the body to show students what Galen had described. If what you found did not match what Galen had described, the assumption was that the discrepancy lay in the variation of the particular body you were examining, not in the accuracy of Galen's account. This is the crucial difference between what medicine did with bodies and what Leonardo did with bodies. Medicine brought Galen to the dissection table and looked for confirmation. Leonardo brought nothing, or rather, he brought only the habit of looking at what was actually there, without the lens of authority, in the same way he had looked at birds and water and the hills above Vinci since childhood. He looked at the body the way he looked at everything, as a thing that had not yet been fully understood, whose principles were waiting to be found by someone willing to look carefully enough. He dissected more than 30 human bodies over the course of his working life. He was systematic about it in a way that the medical anatomy of his era was not. He dissected the same structures multiple times in different bodies to distinguish between what was particular to one specimen and what was general. He dissected at different ages, comparing the structure of an old man's body with the body of a young child, tracing the way the same system changed across a life. He dissected in winter, when he could, the cold, slow decomposition and extended the time available for examination before the body became too compromised to yield reliable information. The drawings that resulted are the most accurate anatomical illustrations ever produced. This is not a sentimental claim. It is the assessment of anatomists and medical historians who have compared them systematically and without sentiment to the actual structures they depict. The muscles of the shoulder, the structure of the skull and its cranial nerves, the anatomy of the eye and the mechanisms of vision, the architecture of the spine and the way its curves distribute weight, the structure of the fetus at different stages of development, the geometry of the limbs and the mechanical principles that govern how they move. In all of these areas, and in others, Leonardo's drawings contain accurate information that medical illustration would not recover for generations, in some cases for centuries. He dissected, on one occasion that the notebooks describe with particular care, a man of approximately 100 years old who had died at the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence. The old man had told Leonardo, in the hours before his death, that he felt no discomfort, only a weakness, and that he was simply running out. He died quietly. Leonardo waited, and then he opened him. What he found in the old man's vascular system was something he had not seen before in the bodies of younger people. The blood vessels were thickened, constricted, the walls hardened and narrowed in ways that the vessels of younger bodies were not. The passages through which blood moved were smaller than they should have been. The interior surfaces of the vessels were irregular, roughened, accumulated with deposits that reduced the diameter of the channels. He understood what he was looking at. He described, in the notebooks, the process by which the walls of blood vessels thicken and stiffen with age, the narrowing of the channels, the reduction of flow that results, the way this process eventually produces a death that feels, from the inside, like simply running out. He connected the appearance of the vessels in the old man to the manner of his death, and he connected both to the process of aging as a systemic change in the body's capacity to move blood effectively through its channels. He was describing atherosclerosis, the progressive thickening and hardening of arterial walls. That is one of the primary mechanisms of cardiovascular disease, the condition that kills more people in the world today than any other single cause. The condition that the medical world would not formally identify and describe until the 19th century and would not begin to understand mechanically until the 20th. Leonardo described it in the early 1500s, in a hospital in Florence, looking at the body of a man who had told him he felt only a weakness, only a running out, and had then died quietly in the way that the very old sometimes die when the machinery of the body finally exhausts its capacity for maintenance. He wrote it in the notebooks, in the mirror script, and moved on to the next dissection. He also, during these years, solved a problem that had defeated every anatomist who had attempted it before him: the accurate depiction of three-dimensional anatomical structures on a two-dimensional surface. The conventional anatomical illustration of Leonardo's era was essentially diagrammatic. It showed structures from a single angle, labeled them with text, and conveyed the information that the text required. It did not attempt to show how the structures related to each other in 3 dimensions, how they looked from different angles, how a surgeon's hand would encounter them in the specific orientation of an actual operation. This limitation was partly technical. The conventions of illustration had not developed tools for representing depth and spatial relationship with the required accuracy, and partly conceptual. The purpose of the illustrations was textual confirmation, not spatial understanding. Leonardo invented a solution. He drew the same structures from multiple angles, the same bone, the same muscle group, the same organ, from 4 or 5 or 8 different viewpoints, arrayed on the page in a sequence that allowed the reader's eye to construct a 3-dimensional understanding from the accumulation of 2-dimensional views. He combined this with cross-section drawings, showing how structures appeared when cut at different depths, so that the reader could understand not just the surface of a structure, but its interior geometry. He called this approach the 12 views. He wrote about it in the notebooks as a method for overcoming the limitation of single perspective illustration, and he described it with the clarity of someone who has understood a problem completely and found a solution that satisfies him. It is the method that modern anatomical atlases use. The Gray's Anatomy that medical students carry today represents structures from multiple angles, with cross-sections exactly as Leonardo described. He did not invent it and publish it, so the medical world arrived at the same solution independently, later, by its own route. But the solution is his in the notebooks, waiting to be found for the 400 years between when he developed it and when the world developed it again. What he found in the bodies he opened is one part of the story. What he did not do with what he found is the other part, and the other part is harder to sit with. He intended to publish a treatise on anatomy. He said so in the notebooks, in terms that suggest genuine planning rather than vague intention. He wrote introductory sections. He organized material by topic. He produced the drawings with a completeness and a care that went beyond what a man keeping private notes for his own reference would require. He was preparing something for transmission. He wrote in one notebook that he would complete the work and make it available, and that when it was available, it would supersede everything that had previously been written on the subject. This was accurate. It would have. The treatise was never completed. The The organized sections became disorganized as he moved and aged and took on other work, and the accumulation of new observations kept extending the scope of what the treatise would need to contain. The introductions he wrote for sections that were ready to be published sat in notebooks alongside material that was still being worked out, and the requirement that everything be ready before anything could go out. The perfectionism that governed all his work meant that nothing went out because something was always still in progress. When he died in France in 1519, the anatomical materials were among the papers he left to Francesco Melzi. Melzi, faithful and attentive, took them back to Italy and kept them with the other notebooks. He organized them, or tried to. He did not publish them. He lacked the specific anatomical training that would have allowed him to assess which drawings were complete and which were provisional, which observations had been superseded by later work and which remained accurate. He kept them intact, which was the right thing to do, and he did not publish them, which meant that the knowledge in them did not enter the world. A partial version of Leonardo's anatomical work was eventually published in 1680, 160 years after his death, in a form that did not include the most significant drawings, in a context in which medicine had, in the intervening century and a half, made some of the same discoveries he had made, and the value of his work was recognized as historical curiosity rather than as active contribution. The full anatomical corpus was not properly published and studied until the 20th century. By that point, what it contained was confirmed as accurate by comparison with what science had independently established. The drawings of the shoulder were right, the drawings of the skull were right, the drawings of the fetus were right, the description of the old man's blood vessels was right, the method of multiple angle depiction was right, the understanding of how muscles worked and how the skeleton transmitted force and how the eye focused light was right. All of it right, all of it private. There is a particular quality to this loss that is different from the loss of the notebooks on hydraulics or flight. Those losses also matter. The knowledge of fluid mechanics that Leonardo held, the aerodynamic principles he derived from watching birds, the engineering insights he accumulated across 6 decades of systematic observation. All of that matters. All of it had to be rediscovered. But the anatomical loss has a different texture because the stakes were different. The knowledge Leonardo held about the human body was not knowledge about phenomena remote from daily human suffering. It was knowledge about the machinery of disease and death. The atherosclerosis he described was killing people in every city in Europe, while the notebooks sat in Melzi's villa. The understanding of the cardiac valves he developed could have accelerated the understanding of heart disease. The embryological observations he made might have improved the understanding of fetal development and the conditions that disrupted it. People were dying of things he understood, not metaphorically. Specifically, the narrowed vessels, the stiffening walls, the reduced flow, the process he had watched in the body of a man who felt only a running out, was running out in bodies across Europe, in people who had no physician who understood what was happening to them. Because the man who had understood it had written it in a private language in a notebook that nobody read. He walks through the anatomy theatre of the Ospedale Maggiore in the early years of the 16th century, this tall, left-handed man in his 50s, with his notebooks and his chalk, and he opens a body and finds in it something that medicine will not find again for 300 years. And he draws it with a precision that has never been matched, and he writes about it in the mirror script, and then he leaves. The body goes back to the earth, the notebook goes into the chest with the others. And outside, in the city that does not know what has just been found in that room, people continue dying in the ways they have always died, from the conditions that have always killed them, in the absence of the knowledge that was found in that room, and then as quietly as it had been found, put away. There is a panel painting in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence that most visitors walk past on their way to see something else. It is large, nearly 2.5 meters wide, nearly 2.5 meters tall. Its surface is the warm brown of old wood, covered with a dense underpainting in earth tones, a preliminary layer of figures and architectural forms and landscape that has the quality of something interrupted mid-sentence. In the center, the Virgin Mary sits with the infant Christ, surrounded by a crowd of figures in attitudes of adoration, kneeling, gesturing, bowing, turning toward the central group in the various ways that a large crowd of people turns towards something that has just arrested their attention. In the background, a ruined architectural structure, horses, figures engaged in struggle, the suggestion of a world at war with itself, in contrast to the stillness at the center. It is extraordinary. Even unfinished, especially unfinished, it is extraordinary. The compositional intelligence it demonstrates, the way the crowd movement is organized to channel attention, the quality of the individual figures, the strange light that comes from nowhere in particular and illuminates everything differently. People who understand painting stop in front of it and do not move for a long time. It was commissioned in 1481. It was due, by the terms of the commission, in 2 years. Leonardo worked on it for approximately a year, producing preparatory drawings of considerable ambition and complexity, laying in the underpainting, beginning to work out the figures. Then he left for Milan. The monks of San Donato, a Scopetto, who had commissioned the Adoration of the Magi and paid for its panel and waited patiently for their altarpiece, never received it. The unfinished panel remained in Florence. Leonardo carried what he needed for Milan and left the rest behind. 21 years later, the monks gave the commission to someone else. Filippino Lippi delivered a finished altarpiece in 1496. It is a competent piece of work. It hangs near Leonardo's unfinished panel in the Uffizi, and it is almost impossible to look at for long. The Adoration of the Magi is the first instance in Leonardo's career of a pattern that would define it, not because it was the first thing he didn't finish. There are signs of incompleteness, earlier, small things, but because it is the first fully commissioned, fully begun, fully announced work of major ambition that he simply left, not abandoned in the sense of giving up on it, left in the sense of walking away from it at a stage that the client and the world have not agreed to accept as complete, in the full understanding that he would probably not be coming back. He did this repeatedly. It became the texture of his professional life, the pattern that his contemporaries noticed and found exasperating and eventually incorporated into their expectations when dealing with him. He was Leonardo. He was extraordinary. He would take the commission and begin it at a level that made everyone around him understand they were witnessing something exceptional. And then, at some point in the process, that was never the same point twice, something would shift and the work would stop progressing, and eventually it would become clear that this was not a pause, but a permanent condition. The Battle of Anghiari, Florence. 15. The Great Hall of the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of the Florentine Republic's government, needed a mural. 2 murals, actually, on opposing walls, depicting victories in Florentine military history. One commission was given to Leonardo. The other, by a decision that could not have been accidental, was given to Michelangelo, who was 31 years old and had just completed the David. The 2 greatest artists in the world given opposing walls in the same room, the collision that every person in Florence who understood art must have been holding their breath to witness. Leonardo was given the Battle of Anghiari, a 15th century Florentine victory over Milan, and he began working with the preparatory intensity that characterized his approach to commissions he was genuinely engaged by. He made drawings, he made more drawings, he studied horses in battle, the specific mechanics of how horses and men moved when they were trying to kill each other, the expressions on the faces of men in combat, the rage, the fear, the specific distortions of features that extreme physical effort and extreme emotion produce simultaneously. He produced preparatory studies of such power that people came from across Florence to watch him work and went away describing what they had seen with the vocabulary of people who have witnessed something that exceeded their expectations. He began painting the wall. He chose, again, not fresco. He chose an experimental technique based on an ancient Roman method he had read about in Pliny. Encaustic, using heated wax to bind the pigments and create a surface with an unusual luminosity and depth. He set up braziers to heat the wall and the pigments. He painted. The technique failed. The heat that was supposed to dry and set the surface instead caused the lower portions of the painting to run, the pigment pooling and sliding before it could set, distorting the forms he had painted. He tried adjustments, he experimented with the temperature, with the application sequence, with the preparation of the surface. The central section of the painting, the fight for the standard, the densest knot of horses and men, was completed and held. The sections around it continued to resist. He stopped painting the wall in 1506 and left Florence. He left for Milan, where the French governor had requested his presence. He left behind a wall that was partly painted, partly sketched, partly blank. He left behind a room that would never have its opposing murals, because Michelangelo, caught up in his own obligations and his own relationship with incompleteness, had also not finished his wall. 2 men, 2 walls, the same hall, both unfinished, both now lost. The Leonardo obliterated by Giorgio Vasari when he remodeled the room in the 1560s. The Michelangelo never even begun beyond preparatory drawings. What survives of the Battle of Anghiari survives in copies, most famously a drawing by Peter Paul Rubens, made from a copy of the central section. The Rubens copy is magnificent. It conveys, across 2 removes from the original, the quality of what Leonardo had been building. The specific violence of the central knot of figures, the horses' mouths open in rage or terror, the men's faces contorted by the effort of killing, the tangle of bodies so dense it becomes almost abstract. It is enough to understand what was lost. It is not enough. Saint Jerome in the Wilderness hangs in the Vatican Pinacoteca. It shows the old saint kneeling in a rocky landscape, his body turned with the specific torsion of a man in the act of self-mortification, his face raised and his expression a compound of anguish and appeal that is among the most powerful faces Leonardo ever drew. The muscular anatomy of Jerome's neck and shoulders is rendered with a precision that could only have come from direct anatomical knowledge. The skin pulled taut over the sternocleidomastoid, the trapezius visible beneath, the age of the body legible in every tendon. The face is barely sketched, not lightly painted, barely begun. Leonardo laid in the composition, developed the figure, worked out the anatomy and the gesture and the landscape and the lion crouching in the lower right corner, with the specific alertness of a real animal, observed rather than invented, and then arrived at the face that was the point, the face that would have been the culmination of everything the figure built toward, and left it as a few strokes of chalk on the prepared panel, no more developed than a note to himself about where the face would be. Nobody knows why. The painting has never been attributed to a specific commission with a known client and a known deadline, so there is no external record of it being abandoned in a particular set of circumstances. It simply exists in the state he left it, at the stage he left it, and the face remains unresolved and no explanation has survived. The pattern exists. It is real and it is documented across decades of work. It is not an artifact of bad luck or unfortunate circumstances or a single character flaw manifesting in isolated incidents. It is structural. It is what Leonardo's engagement with a major commission eventually did, with a consistency that makes the question not whether, but when and why. The simple reading is perfectionism, the inability to declare anything complete, because completion exposed the gap between what he had envisioned and what the physical world would allow the work to become. He could see, with more precision than any painter who had ever lived, exactly what a painting should be. The specific quality of light, the specific expression, the specific relationship between every element on the surface. He could see this in his mind with a completeness and a fidelity that the mirror script and the notebooks were, in part, attempts to hold. And he could also see, with the same precision, the distance between what he had envisioned and what he had managed to put on the panel. Finishing the painting made that distance permanent, made it public, made it the definitive record of what he had achieved, rather than what he was still reaching for. A finished thing can be judged. He had learned, at 24, exactly what it cost to be judged. This reading has force. It connects the pattern of the unfinished to the wound that part 2 of this story planted. to the mirror writing and the notebooks and the distance he maintained between what he knew and what the world could access. It makes the abandoned commissions continuous with the secrecy of the anatomical discoveries and the failure to publish the hydraulics and the flight mechanics. Everything he most fully possessed, he held inside. Releasing it, finishing it, publishing it, delivering it, meant accepting the judgment of people who could not see what he had seen and would evaluate the work against standards he had already surpassed in his own understanding. This reading is probably partly right, but it is not the only reading, and the other reading matters because it points towards something in Leonardo that is not simply a wound or a defense mechanism, but a genuine orientation toward the work itself. He wrote, in the notebooks, "A painter is not admirable unless he is universal." He meant this. He pursued it. The universality he was reaching for was not a quantity of subjects mastered or a range of techniques demonstrated. It was something harder to name, a completeness of understanding, an apprehension of the principles that governed all visual phenomena and their relationships to each other and to the physical world that produced them. He was trying to understand, through the practice of making images, what seeing actually was, what the eye did, what light did, what the relationship between a three-dimensional world and its two-dimensional representation required at a level of truth that no convention could supply. This investigation could not be completed, not because he was failing to complete it, but because the thing he was investigating did not have a completion point. Every painting he made taught him something that the next painting would need to incorporate. Every problem he solved revealed the shape of the next problem, which was larger and required more. The universality was always ahead of where he was. In this reading, the unfinished paintings are not symptoms of a failure, but evidence of an inquiry. The adoration of the Magi stopped not because Leonardo gave up on it, but because he understood more, working on it, than he had understood when he began it. And what he understood now required something different than what he had been making. And what he had been making could not be unmade, so he left it at the stage it was and carried the new understanding to Milan. Both readings can be true simultaneously. They are not mutually exclusive. The wound and the method are not the same thing, but they can produce the same behavior. A man who cannot finish because he fears judgment, and a man who cannot finish because he keeps discovering that the work requires more than any finished version could contain, will both leave a trail of incomplete things behind them. The trail is identical. The interior states that produced it are not. What is certain is the Mona Lisa. He began it around 1503. The subject was Lisa Gherardini, wife of a Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo, who had commissioned the portrait to celebrate either the birth of their second son or the completion of a new house. The historical record is not certain which. The commission was of the kind that Leonardo had been receiving and not fulfilling for 20 years. A portrait, a defined subject, a client with reasonable expectations. He began it. He painted it with an attention and a sustained engagement that exceeded anything the commission required. He returned to it repeatedly. Over years, he refined the atmosphere of the background, the blue-grey landscape receding into mist, the bridges barely visible, the water with a delicacy of gradation that required techniques he had developed specifically for this surface. The sfumato method of applying tiny strokes of nearly transparent pigment until solid forms dissolved at their edges into the atmosphere surrounding them. The way things actually dissolve in actual atmosphere when you look at them from a distance. He painted her hands with an attention that made them, to the anatomists who have studied the painting, among the most accurately rendered hands in the history of art. He painted the specific quality of light on the specific texture of her skin with an observation so precise that researchers using infrared imaging in the 21st century found multiple layers of paint, each one an infinitesimal adjustment of the one beneath, the record of a man going back again and again to the surface and finding in it something that needed to be different. He never delivered it. Francesco del Giocondo, who had paid for a portrait of his wife to hang in his home, never hung it. Whether he was told it was still in progress, whether he was told there was a problem, whether he eventually understood that Leonardo had simply decided to keep it, and there was nothing to be done about this. The historical record does not say. He commissioned another portrait from Raphael and presumably hung that one instead. Leonardo carried the Mona Lisa to Milan, and then to Rome, and then to France. He worked on it in France, in the house the French king had given him at Clos-Lucé, in the rooms he inhabited for the last 3 years of his life. He was 67 when he died. The painting had been in his possession for 16 years. The woman in the painting is somewhere between 24 and 26 years old. She has not aged. She is exactly as old as she was in 1503, exactly as she was the first time he looked at her and understood that what she required, the specific quality of her expression, the specific way the light from the left was moving across her face, the specific compound of what she was thinking and feeling and being at this moment, required more than he had yet given her. He was still giving her more when he died. She was still there when they found him. Still, slightly unfinished. Still his. In the autumn of 1516, Leonardo da Vinci packed his notebooks and his paintings into cases, gathered the small household that travelled with him, his pupils, his servants, a cook, and crossed the Alps into France. He was 64 years old. He had been in Italy his entire life. He had been born in Tuscany and apprenticed in Florence, and spent 20 years in Milan, and wandered between Venice and Mantua and Florence and Rome in the years after that, always within the borders of the peninsula, always in the particular world of Italian courts and Italian workshops, and Italian patrons who needed things and paid for things, and drove the complex, exhausting, endlessly productive commerce of Italian Renaissance culture. He had never left. Now he was leaving. The invitation came from Francois I, the new French king, 22 years old, on the throne for less than a year, possessed of an appetite for art and intellect that his recent military campaigns into Italy had sharpened rather than satisfied. He had met Leonardo in Milan, had seen the Last Supper on the wall of Santa Maria delle Grazie, and reportedly wanted to have the wall itself transported to France, and had been dissuaded only by the engineering impossibility of the proposal. He could not have the wall, but he could have the man who had painted it. He offered Leonardo everything he had not been offered before. Not a commission, not a project with deliverables and deadlines, and the particular tension that deliverables and deadlines had always produced in the gap between what Leonardo could see and what he could complete. The offer was simpler and stranger than that. Francois I wanted Leonardo nearby. He wanted to be able to talk to him, to eat with him, to show him to the court and to foreign visitors as a demonstration of what French patronage could attract. He gave him a house, the Château du Clos-Lucé, a small manor house of warm red brick set in the grounds of the royal estate at Amboise, connected to the king's own residence by a tunnel that ran underground between the two buildings so that the king could visit without ceremony at any hour without requiring Leonardo to do anything except be there and be himself. He gave him a stipend, an annual salary generous enough to sustain the household and the work, not contingent on what the work produced. He asked for nothing specific in return. This was unprecedented. Leonardo had spent his entire adult life in the economy of patronage, which was an economy of exchange. You received resources, and in return you produced things. You solved problems. You attended the patron's needs and vanities and strategic requirements. You were present and useful and capable of being deployed toward whatever the patron's situation required. The terms could be generous, or they could be mean. The patron could be cultivated or crude. The work be work you wanted to do or work you endured in order to have the access and the stability for the work that mattered. But the structure was always exchange. You were there because you were useful. Francois I did not want Leonardo to be useful in the conventional sense. He wanted him to be Leonardo. The old man settled into Clos-Lucé in the autumn of 1516 and began what would turn out to be the last chapter of his life in a house that faced west over the Loire Valley, in a landscape so different from Tuscany flatter, wider, the sky larger, the light falling differently across a country that had organized itself around the great river rather than the hills. That everything he saw was new, was available to be looked at with fresh attention, was not yet encoded into the habit of familiarity that makes things invisible. He was not idle. He designed festivals for the French court, elaborate theatrical spectacles involving mechanical devices and programmed movements and the transformation of space through light and music and motion, the kind of total environment that his engineering and artistic capacities combined uniquely to produce. He designed a canal system for the Loire region, connecting the rivers in ways that would improve navigation and support agriculture, drawing on the hydraulic knowledge that filled hundreds of his notebook pages and had been accumulating since he first watched the Mraznika. No, the streams of Vinci, moving over stones in his childhood. He made drawings for an ideal city for the French court, a planned urban environment built around principles of sanitation and circulation and human scale that the cities of his era had nowhere achieved. None of these projects was completed. None of them was expected to be completed. They were evidence of the activity of a mind that had not stopped moving, that continued producing as a matter of its own nature rather than in response to external demand, the way a river continues moving regardless of whether anyone is watching it or using it. The notebooks continued filling. The left hand, the hand he had always used, the hand that had written the mirror script for 60 years across 13,000 pages, continued its work. The right hand was another matter. Sometime in 1517 or 1518, the timing is imprecise, reported second-hand by observers whose technical vocabulary for describing what they saw was limited. Leonardo suffered a stroke that partially paralyzed his right side. He had no use of his right hand. This was observed by a cardinal who visited Clos-Lucé in October of 1517 and recorded in his secretary's diary. Leonardo could no longer paint with the color and delicacy he had been capable of, though he still directed his pupils and occasionally drew with his left hand. Consider what that meant. A man who had spent his life looking at the world with the specific intensity of someone who needed to understand what he saw well enough to represent it, who had studied birds and water and faces and bodies and the behavior of light, with an attention so sustained and so precise that it had produced the most accurate anatomical drawings in the history of Western medicine, the most carefully observed atmospheric landscapes in the history of Western painting, the most technically sophisticated inquiry into the mechanics of the visible world that any single human mind had ever conducted, was left, in the last years of his life, with the eye intact and the translating hand gone. He could still see, he could still understand what he saw. He could still think in the interior theatre that had been running since childhood, with full access to everything he had accumulated. He simply could not, any longer, paint with the precision that his understanding required. He had one painting with him in France, possibly three by some accounts, a Saint John the Baptist, a Saint Anne, and the Mona Lisa. The Saint Anne he appears to have worked on. There are accounts of him applying finishing touches to it during the Clos-Lucé years. The Mona Lisa he kept. There is no record that he worked on it further after his arrival in France, though there is also no record that he considered it finished. It was in the bedroom. Francesco Melzi was with him. This requires a paragraph because Melzi is among the figures in Leonardo's life who are most often reduced to a footnote, and who deserve considerably more than that. He had come to Leonardo's household in Milan around 1506, when he was approximately 15 and Leonardo was 54. He came from a noble Milanese family, was handsome and capable, and attached himself to Leonardo with a devotion that he sustained without apparent interruption for the remaining 13 years of Leonardo's life, and then for the decades after it, during which he organized and preserved the notebooks with a care that, while falling short of publication, at least kept the materials together long enough for some of them to survive. Why a young man from a wealthy family chose to spend his life in service to an elderly genius is a question the historical record does not fully answer. What the historical record shows is that he did choose this, consistently, over many years, in the specific form of presence and care that a person gives only to someone they have decided matters to them. He traveled with Leonardo through the difficult Roman years, managed the household, served as an assistant and an amanuensis, took dictation when Leonardo needed to record a thought that the paralyzed hand could no longer commit to paper quickly enough. He was there at clos lucé. He was there in the ways that people who have decided someone matters to them are there, through the days and the evenings and the particular quality of late years, when the circle of people a man can count on has contracted to the few who have remained when others have moved on. The French king was also there, regularly. The tunnel between Amboise and Clos Lucé was used, and its use is documented in the accounts of courtiers and visitors who noted the king's habit of passing through it to spend time with the old man in the small manor house. What they talked about is mostly not recorded. The king was apparently interested in everything Leonardo was willing to discuss. The canal designs, the physiological observations that accumulated in the notebooks alongside the technical drawings. He asked questions, and Leonardo answered them, and the conversations continued over years. Francois I said at some point during this period, "The exact occasion is not documented, and the remarks survived in the accounts of others who heard it reported, that he believed no man had ever known as much as Leonardo, and that he could not believe such a man had been born." This is the kind of statement that gets smoothed into legend over time, losing the specific texture of the actual moment in which it was spoken. The actual moment would have had the specificity that actual moments always have. The king in a particular chair, in a particular room, at a particular point in a conversation. The old man across from him, with his notebooks and his paralyzed hand, and the accumulation of 60 years of looking at everything with more attention than anyone had ever brought to it. And the king finding, in this man's company, something that the court and the campaigns and the ordinary business of being a king did not give him. He simply found it worth saying. It is the most generous thing anyone said about Leonardo in his lifetime, and it was said by a man who had no particular reason to say it, except that it was true. April 23rd, 1519. Leonardo dictated his will. The will is a document of practical arrangements, the disposal of property, the obligations to servants, the directions for his funeral. He specified the number of masses to be said, the churches in which they were to be said, the candles to be placed, and their sizes, the details of the funeral procession. He specified these things with the attention to specificity that characterized everything he did, the same attention he had brought to the angle of a valve or the behavior of water around a stone, applied now to the management of his own departure. He left the notebooks to Francesco Melzi. The paintings, those he still had, went to his pupil Salai, who had been with him since Milan. He left money to his half-brothers in Florence, with whom he had maintained a complicated and somewhat distant relationship across the decades of his adult life. He left money to his servants. He signed the will with a hand that the document describes as having been impaired by illness. The signature is still there in the archives. It is legible, if shaky. The left hand, still working. 9 days later, on the 2nd of May 1519, Leonardo da Vinci died at Clos Lucé. He was 67 years old. The cause of death is listed as a stroke. The manner of it is not recorded in any document of unimpeachable reliability. What is recorded in a contemporary account by the goldsmith Benvenuto Cellini, who was not present but recorded what he had been told, is that the king was with him at the end, that Francois I held him in his arms as he died. Whether this is true cannot be confirmed. Cellini was not a witness. The account was written decades later. The story has the shape of a story that needs to be true. The king who had given the old man his last year's present at their end, the man who said no one had ever known as much dying in the arms of the man who recognized what that knowledge was worth. But the shape of a story that needs to be true is not the same as confirmation that it is true. What is true is that the king was nearby, that he used the tunnel regularly, that the household at Clos Lucé would have known when the end was close, as households always know, and that someone would have sent word through the tunnel, and that the king, who found this man's company worth seeking in ordinary times, would have had reason to seek it in the extraordinary ones. Whether he was in the room, holding him, is not something the record confirms. Whether it matters is a question the listener can hold. What is certain is the room afterward, the notebooks in their careful stacks, the paintings against the wall, the designs for the canal, the city, the festival. The left hand that had spent 60 years moving right to left across pages of mirror script, filling 13,000 surviving pages with the record of a mind that did not stop looking until it stopped. And the Mona Lisa, still there, still in the room, 26 years old forever, looking at the painter who had looked at her longer than he had looked at any other thing in a life defined by the length and the depth and the patient relentlessness of his looking. He had given her 16 years. He had never decided she was finished. She outlived him by 5 centuries and counting, hanging now behind bulletproof glass in a room in Paris, visited by 10 million people a year who stand 20 feet away from her for 90 seconds and then are moved along. Most of them not knowing that the man who painted her carried her across the Alps when he was 64 years old and looked at her every morning in a house in the Loire Valley until the morning he could no longer look at anything. She was the last thing he kept. He had given everything else away, or had it taken from him, or had left it unfinished in cities across Italy. The long trail of abandoned panels and unmixed pigments and clay models and uncast bronze and undelivered portraits and unpublished notebooks stretching back 40 years behind him. But this he kept, because he was still looking, because there was still, even at the end, something in that face that he had not yet found the way to say. Francesco Melzi brought the notebooks back to Italy. He was 27 years old when Leonardo died. He had been with him for 13 years. He carried the papers and the notebooks and the loose leaves of drawings back across the Alps to the family estate at Vaprio d'Adda, near Milan, where he installed them in a room and spent the rest of his life organizing what he could organize and protecting what he could protect, and failing, slowly, to transmit them to the world in the form that would have allowed the world to receive them. He lived to 75. He died in 1570, 51 years after Leonardo, with the notebooks still in his possession, still in the room, still substantially unread by anyone who was not his guest and who did not happen to ask to see them. He wrote one treatise on painting, using Leonardo's notes as source material, which he completed but did not publish in his lifetime, and which was not published until 1651, 80 years after his death, 132 years after Leonardo's. The treatise on painting is the only organized transmission of Leonardo's thought that emerged from the notebooks in anything approaching the form Leonardo had intended. It covers a fraction of what the notebooks contain. It covers none of the anatomy, none of the hydraulics, none of the aeronautics, none of the geology, none of the engineering. It covers painting, the properties of light, the theory of color, the depiction of human figures, the relationship between the painter and the natural world. It is, in its own terms, extraordinary. It is also a very small percentage of what was in the room. After Melzi died, what happened to the notebooks is a story that unfolds across the following century, like something breaking in slow motion. Melzi's heirs did not understand what they had inherited. This is documented in the account of a sculptor named Pompeo Leoni, who visited Vaprio d'Adda in the 1580s and found the notebooks in a state of partial neglect. Still stored, still present, but no longer actively protected. Accessible to whoever visited and asked to see them in the casual way that people ask to see things they do not fully understand. Leoni took some of them. Others had apparently already been taken by various visitors over the preceding decade. He took a significant portion of the anatomical drawings and the engineering drawings, reorganized them into 2 large bound volumes, and eventually brought them to Spain, where he worked at the court of Philip II. One of these volumes, containing most of the surviving anatomical work, came into the possession of the English Royal Collection in the early 17th century, when it was purchased by an agent of King Charles I. It is the volume now in the Royal Collection at Windsor Castle, the volume that contains the drawing of the fetus, the drawing of the heart, the drawings of the spine and the skull, and the mechanisms of the eye. It arrived in Windsor and was catalogued and shelved. For most of the 17th and 18th centuries, the Windsor volumes were known to exist and were occasionally examined by scholars with sufficient connections to access the Royal Collection. They were admired as extraordinary examples of draftsmanship. The science in them was not recognized as science. It was recognized as the preparatory work of a painter who had studied anatomy more carefully than painters usually studied anatomy. The drawings were understood in the context of art, which meant the information they contained was not evaluated in the context of medicine. The man who first began to evaluate them as medicine rather than as art was an anatomist named Giovanni Battista Venturi, who published a study of Leonardo's scientific manuscripts in 1797. Not a comprehensive study, a preliminary one, a paper that said in effect, "There is more in these drawings than anyone has been looking for, and the more deserves serious attention." Venturi's paper was published and noted, and incorporated into the growing field of Leonardo scholarship, and the incorporation was slow. The full scientific study of the Windsor anatomical corpus, the systematic comparison of Leonardo's drawings with modern anatomical knowledge, the evaluation of his findings against what subsequent science had established, the assessment of what he had understood and what he had misunderstood, and what he had understood that medicine would not establish for centuries, did not happen until the 20th century. The key works appeared in the 1950s and 1960s, produced by a collaboration between art historians and surgeons and anatomists, who were finally asking the question that Venturi had gestured towards. What did Leonardo actually know? The answer, assembled across those years of careful study, was considerably more than anyone had understood. Meanwhile, the rest of the notebooks had scattered. The volumes Leone had not taken, the loose pages and the small pocket notebooks, and the workshop records, and the theoretical writings, continued their dispersion through the decades following Melzi's death. Some went to the Ambrosiana Library in Milan, donated in 1637 by Orazio Leone, Pompeio's son, who had inherited his father's Leonardo collection, the Codex Atlanticus, a massive compilation of drawings and writings covering engineering, weaponry, hydraulics, optics, and natural philosophy, assembled by Pompeo Leone from loose pages, is now in the Ambrosiana. It runs to nearly 1,200 pages. Some notebooks went to Spain with the Leone collection and eventually dispersed further. The Madrid Codices, 2 notebooks containing work on mechanics and geometry, sat in the National Library of Spain for 300 years in a condition that the library's cataloguers had at some point incorrectly described. They were listed in inventories, but listed incorrectly, the descriptions not matching the contents, which meant that when scholars looked for them, they looked in the wrong place, and when they looked in the wrong place and did not find them, they concluded that the notebooks had been lost. They had not been lost. They were in Madrid. They were found in 1965 by an American scholar named Jules Picus, who was looking for something else entirely: Spanish ballads. He was researching Spanish ballads, and who happened to request a manuscript listed in an old inventory and received, instead of the ballads he had requested, 2 notebooks in Leonardo's handwriting. He recognized what he was looking at. He reported the discovery. The scholarly world, which had operated for 300 years on the assumption that these particular notebooks were gone, adjusted. This is not an isolated incident. It is the pattern of Leonardo's posthumous history. Things that were believed lost turn out not to be lost, but misattributed, miscatalogued, misidentified, in the wrong collection, under the wrong name, on the wrong shelf, waiting not to be rediscovered because they had never been found in the first place, but to be noticed for the first time by someone who happened to look at them with the right question. In 1994, Bill Gates purchased the Codex Leicester, a notebook of 72 pages containing Leonardo's observations on water, geology, and astronomy. at auction for $30.8 million. It is now the most expensive book ever sold. It circulates, on loan, to museums around the world, where it is exhibited behind glass and studied by scholars and viewed by visitors who stand in front of it, understanding that they are looking at something important, without always knowing what the importance is. The Codex Leicester was not lost. It had been in various private collections since the 18th century, passing through the hands of Thomas Coke and then various subsequent owners, available to scholars who could arrange access. It was available and it was not widely studied, and the reason it was not widely studied is that it was a notebook of observations about water, written in mirror script in 15th century Italian by a man primarily known as a painter, and the people responsible for deciding what was worth studying had categories for painters that did not easily accommodate a painter who had spent decades systematically investigating the behavior of water. The loss is not a single event. That is the thing about it that is most important to understand. It is not the case that there was a moment when everything went wrong, a specific disaster that could have been prevented, a single fire or flood or theft that removed what Leonardo had produced from the possibility of transmission. The loss is a process. It is the cumulative result of 50 years of Melzi's devoted but incomplete stewardship, of heirs who did not know what they had, of a scholarly apparatus that could see what Leonardo had drawn, but not always what he had understood, of institutions that housed the materials without always reading them, of categories that kept the art and the science in separate rooms and lost the crucial connection between them. The loss is also, at its root, Leonardo's own. Not entirely, not even primarily. The structural failures of transmission that followed his death were real and consequential, and their effects cannot be undone. But the man who intended to publish the treatise on anatomy and did not, who intended to publish the work on water and did not, who intended to publish the work on flight and did not, who carried 13,000 pages of mirror script across the Alps because he could not put them down and could not finish them and could not release them. That man made choices repeatedly that determined what the world could receive and what it could not. He was not naive about this. He wrote in one of the notebooks a self-assessment that has been quoted by every biographer and resists quotation without losing something. Tell me if anything was ever done. 4 words in Italian. A question directed at himself. Written in the notebook, along with the hydraulic calculations and the anatomical observations and the designs for machines that the world would not build for centuries. A man asking himself, in the privacy of the mirror script, whether the extraordinary accumulation of his interior life had produced anything that had entered the world. He knew that it had not. Not in the form he had intended. Not in the transmissible form that would have allowed the hydraulics to reach the engineers, and the anatomy to reach the physicians, and the aeronautics to reach the men who would eventually, 400 years later, watch birds and draw diagrams in wind tunnels and understand what he had understood from riverbanks in Tuscany. He knew this, and he continued, not in spite of the knowledge, but in some complicated relation to it that the 4 words open onto without resolving. He continued filling the notebooks in the years after he wrote that sentence. He continued working on the paintings he would not finish. He continued investigating the problems that the publication he had not completed had not transmitted to the people who needed them. Whether this is a failure of nerve or a form of integrity, whether the withholding was fear or something closer to the conviction that the work was not ready, that releasing it prematurely would be worse than not releasing it at all, is a question the notebooks do not answer. The 4 words ask the question. The notebooks are the evidence on both sides simultaneously. What was finally lost, what the dispersal and the delay and the centuries of miscatalogue and misattribution and slow scholarly recovery could not fully restore, is not the specific discoveries. Most of those, the anatomy, the hydraulics, the aeronautics, the geology, the optics, were eventually rediscovered by other people working in other centuries from different starting points and arriving at the same places through their own routes. What was lost was the route itself. Leonardo's method, the specific combination of direct observation and visual reasoning and cross-domain thinking that allowed him to move from watching a bird's wing to understanding lift, from dissecting an old man's arteries to understanding cardiovascular disease, from watching water move around a stone to understanding turbulence. This method was not transmitted. It existed in the notebooks as practice, as procedure, as the accumulated record of how a particular mind had approached a particular set of problems across 60 years of working life. The notebooks, read whole, are not a collection of discoveries. They are a record of a method. The method is more valuable than any of the individual discoveries it produced, because the individual discoveries were going to be made eventually by someone through whatever alternative route the history of science provided. The method was not going to be made. It was not going to emerge from the institutional practices of any university or any workshop or any court in Europe. It had emerged from this specific combination of this specific person's early formation and injuries and gifts and obsessions and the particular quality of attention he had developed through 6 decades of sustained practice. And the method, because it was never formalized, because the treatises that would have extracted it from the specific notebooks and offered it as procedure were never finished, because the man who possessed it died in a small house in France with the notebooks in cases and the paintings against the wall, the method was lost with him, not permanently. Historians of science have spent decades reconstructing it from the notebooks, describing it, analyzing it, arguing about its specific character and its relationship to the scientific method that developed in the century following Leonardo's death. The reconstruction is good work, it is honest and careful, and it has produced genuine understanding. It is also not the same as the transmission that would have happened if he had finished the treatises and published them in 1500 or 1510 or 1515, when the people who would have read them were alive and working and carrying questions that his method was built to answer. The transmission that would have happened then did not happen. What happened instead is what always happens when knowledge is held privately until the moment for its transmission has passed. The world arrived at the same understanding eventually, through longer routes and at greater cost. And when it arrived, it looked back at the record of what Leonardo had known and written in his notebooks, and it recognized what it found there, and it marked the distance between when the knowledge had been possessed and when it had finally been received. The distance, in most cases, was measured in centuries. In the case of the aortic valve, the distance was 500 years. In the case of the geological processes he described, the slow movement of the Earth's surface, the rising of seafloors into mountains across timescales that dwarfed human history, the distance was 350 years. To the geologists of the 19th century who established what Leonardo had written in his notebooks in the late 1400s. In the case of the aerodynamic principles he derived from watching birds and recording what he saw with the precision of a man who understood that what he was seeing was not common knowledge and would not become common knowledge unless he set it down. The distance was 400 years to the Wright brothers, who solved the problem of controlled flight in 1903 using principles that Leonardo had described in the mirror script and left in a chest. 300 years, 400 years, 500 years. These are not abstract numbers. They are the measurement of a specific gap between when the knowledge existed and when it was usable, the gap across which people continued to die of conditions he had understood, continued to drown in floods whose behavior he had described, continued to fail at flight, using methods he had already ruled out. He knew some of this. The 4 words suggest he knew some of this. Whether knowing it and continuing was tragedy, or integrity, or both simultaneously, whether the life's work tallied honestly, amounts to the most extraordinary private accumulation of knowledge in human history, and also to a failure of transmission that cost the world centuries it did not need to lose. This is the question that the notebooks keep asking. They have been asking it since 1519. They have not yet received a satisfactory answer.